Until you're done. Okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order. This is the December 11th, 2017 Issaquah City Council Committee work session. This is, I've lost track, but this is another one of our budget work sessions. The agenda tonight consists of two items. One is Agenda Bill 7250, Transportation Benefit District, and the second item is specifically regards our proposed 2018 budget. Oh, it says right here, 6th budget work session. Our last one is scheduled for Wednesday, should we need it. So let's get right to work here on the first item, Agenda Bill 7250, Transportation Benefit District. So what do we have for that, Bob?
Okay, so this has been to CIC and alternative committees. We've had presentations on this TBD before. If you may recall, at the last budget session, there was a desire to have a conversation regarding the TBD in the full context of potential funding for transportation projects, as well as thinking about some of those projects within the scope of overall capital improvements that the city desires to make. So we didn't have any presentation to present tonight because we've gone through this several times in the past, unless there's a desire for just kind of an update on what a TBD is and what you need to do. But it did, in terms of financing option, did get referred back to the work session here of council to talk about within the budget.
So it's my understanding that the question before the council is where this topic would go next, and the next stop would be potentially back to the full council with a possible motion regarding whether the council wants to consider establishing a transportation benefit district, and that motion would also include direction to the administration to set a public hearing.
Yep, that's exactly right.
And so so I think what you've talked about is that it's been to council infrastructure, and it's been to work session, and it's been here. We've talked about the substantive meat of it, about what TBDs are and why we're considering it, and tonight would be whether the council is interested in considering having that tool, which would, if we approved it at a future session, regular meeting, then it would be to approve establishing a district, but anything beyond that, projects, that's all a completely separate.
Yeah.
So,
projects, financing, all those things would be a separate conversation down the road.
Okay. So I will open it up for questions. Paul?
Jump ahead to the process. There would be a public hearing, and did I read in here that, and I'm sorry, I didn't find my notes yet, that the public hearing has to also identify what the projects would be?
Andy?
RCW says that you have to have a public hearing at the time that you're considering establishing the district, but future public hearing when you're talking about the projects. Is that what you're talking about, Paul?
It could be the second one.
Okay. Does anybody know?
You got it right there.
I'm gonna pull up some slides that walk through a TBD, and does that sound good?
Sure. I don't know that
Yeah, it's on page 25 of the packet.
Yeah.
There's a slide from the consultant, and it says notice and public hearing. Publish notice at least one time, at least 10 days before hearing. Notice to specify the transportation improvements and functions.
That's the formation.
So typically what would happen is anything within the city's TIP would just be essentially incorporated into the TBD. So there, to be specific, as long as you incorporated that, but in terms of what projects would be funded by the TBD and stuff, that's not something we are proposing to do at this point. As long as the TIP is what is incorporated as part of the TIP, it's fine.
What I'm getting at with my question is, so I'd like to better understand what the steps going forward would be, and is there this public hearing, this notice and public hearing, and is there really two? Is there just one? And which one does the specificity of the transportation improvements and functions need to be included? And are you saying that then just referencing our TIP is sufficient?
So the state statute on this defines transportation improvement means a project contained in a transportation plan of the state, regional transportation planning organization, city, county, or eligible jurisdiction. So it's just as the city administrator spoke about, as long as it's in one of our plans and is referenced in that ordinance, that's sufficient.
So the TIP could be referenced?
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Oh,
Let me just follow on. I was wondering how much specificity was required. I know, and if it's just the list, if it's just the entire TIP, then that's a different effort than I recall us doing when we did the bond. We had to be very specific on projects. So I guess we're saying here that the RCW doesn't require us to be project specific. It can be TIP broad. So I'm trying to, okay, thank you.
so the other option too is if the council desires to move this to the December 18th council meeting or a different council meeting and for consideration at that time, then there's still time for more question and information if you could ask for clarification on that. Because my understanding of what happens is that then this body becomes the legislative body for that district that's set up, and it becomes a separate taxing authority. And there's responsibilities that go along with that completely separately from Issaquah City Council duties. So there may be more questions related to that, and maybe what I'm hearing from Paul is that, okay, maybe setting up the boundaries with a hearing is the first step, but then what? But then what happens? And so maybe it's some more information about the next steps if the council were to approve that. Maybe that could be provided if the council wishes to move this forward to a regular meeting. Other questions? Tola?
So I continue to not have a clear idea about how this would fall in terms of the impact on the community as compared to more or less progressive taxation. And by progressive, I don't mean politically progressive, I mean progressive to income, right? Where car tabs, of course, are as regressive as you could possibly get insofar as anybody with a vehicle, it's essentially a head tax. And then of the options that are available to us constitutionally in this state, property taxes are the most progressive compared to sales taxes in that they impact the affluent more than they impact the less affluent who spend a larger chunk of their income on taxable goods. So I still don't know what I think about this. I still don't feel like I have my arms around what this means for the average resident in the city. And so if you were to go out and ask 100 people what they think is fair and equitable to help us, I mean, I think fundamentally the effort to get ahead of the infrastructure that we need is awesome and super important right now. I still don't know if I feel, and I guess I'm saying it for the third time, I still don't know if I feel like I am confident on how this would impact the residents of the city. So I'm nervous about approving it today.
So just to be clear, just so we understand what today's potential step is and what the question is. The question is whether we move it forward for consideration,
right,
not whether we approve it. So, and then to answer your other question, not to answer it, but it's my understanding that the option is an additional sales tax or vehicle tab charges that you could start off with 20, and then you can wait 24 months if those have been in effect, and you can raise it to 40 if you want to, and some jurisdictions do that. So, and there's still time for those questions to be answered, and establishing a district doesn't set any kind of card tab fees or sales tax amounts. That's my understanding. So, Bob, tell me if I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. We're not suggesting at this time to impose a tax on it. We're simply saying, let's set up the legal structure affiliated with it. You can adopt the TIP as projects, and then council can, as the board, can talk about those two options. Now, you're asking another question, which is, would be an alternative means outside the TBD to fund certain projects, whether it should be capital property taxes or some other form. It's a slightly different question, but I think once if the council chose to adopt the ordinance that would allow for a TBD, then when we get into that conversation around whether to impose a tax or not, we could certainly give you a detailed analysis. I could go on and on, but I'll leave it at that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I'm coming at it from the position of I don't like this tax, and I sort of was hoping to be convinced that it was sufficient. I think property taxes are more progressive and thus more fair in a state that has the least progressive taxation in the western half of the United States. I don't want to pile more regressive taxation on, so I'm loath to support this bill.
Okay. So,
I understand it isn't making the final decision, but it's going down that path. And I also feel like we talked about this other option that would be property tax. And in fact, there's some information on it from earlier conversations. And yet it doesn't feel to me like it's a serious option in front of us because we're going down this other path and spending a lot of time on this other path. And because I don't like it, it doesn't feel like we're given an even consideration of the other options.
okay. So I would frame it as whether you're in favor, whether the council members are in favor of considering whether it's a tool we want in our toolbox. And so in a few minutes, I think we have to do a thumbs up, thumbs down about what we're going to do with this agenda bill. And so there's more
Just my finishing thought is I would encourage my fellow council members to be thumbs down on this because it's regressive.
Sure. No, I heard you. I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew what the question was going to be. Bill?
I want to make sure because you're calling for questions, and that's clarification, and I don't have questions, I have comments. So I don't know if you're ready for comment yet. You okay?
Go ahead.
All right. So I have some agreement with Tola on this. I keep hearing the words used, we just need another tool in our tool belt. And that just really gets the hair on the back of my neck rising up, because if I'm a finished carpenter, I don't need a sledgehammer in my tool belt. You know, it's a tool, you put a tool in your tool belt that you're going to use. And so the point of this is to implement a tax. We're trying to say, oh, we're just starting a legal structure, we're not really taxing yet, but you wouldn't be doing this if you haven't. And some of the pre-work that came from this, and this, I don't know this for sure, but somehow came from a lot of discussions with the financial committee. And so a couple of you were on there and talked about all sorts of options and so forth, and basically came forward with this option. And this has been pushed for almost a year, feeling like this is the only option. It's very much of a push to do this, and this is the option that's considered. And I'm not there. I'm with Tola. There's in many ways here, there's just, I'm not sure I want to put another tax on people. I'm not sure if we could convince me that we do want to tax more, that this is the only one we're considering. So I'm just having a hard time working through that process. And to look at this prior to our budget being determined, to me makes it even harder to swallow, because I can't, you're looking at additional funding sources and prior to determining the budget. And that's a little bit of the cart before the horse for me. So yes, if you look at some big pictures and there's some big numbers there, but if you need to look for more money, in my mind, and here's the problem with the budget I'm having overall, is the existing budget really needs to tighten up. And you need to look at that with a whole different light before you go to somebody asking for more money. And I don't think we've done that at all in this budget cycle and this work that we've been doing for these last month and a half or whatever. I don't think we've gotten to the bottom of really good budgeting to have a good, tight financial budget that says we're doing everything we can here. We're still this many dollars short, and this is how we have to work towards that. And these are some tools. I think there's other options that have not been discussed for various reasons. And so I just cannot support this going forward at this point in time. And there's a bunch of reasons, including the one Stola mentioned. And those are some of mine. Till you ask somebody for more money, you got to really show them everywhere your dollars are spent and why you can't free up some more money from other places. And I don't think we're doing that at all in our current budget discussions.
Sure, I do too. Go ahead.
So maybe a question for Bob first and then a comment. So in a lot of our major road projects, when we look at how they're funded, they have various funding sources. So it looks to me like the intention here is to provide another option of a funding source, meaning that this wouldn't be the funding source that funds all road projects. But if we were to go out to the voters with a package, we may tell them we're going to use 3 funding sources. One is the TBD, and it's this dollar value. But the other 2 sources, the levy lid and whatever, are also in there. And then we would have a total homeowner impact. So it's not this or nothing. This is could be another piece of a funding pipe for projects. And would that level of transparency be there? So say we picked Newport Way and said, that's it, that's the one we're going for, and it will be funded with these following 5 sources. That would all be transparent during the vote to the public, dollars attached with each piece.
So if you were to go to the public, you would have to identify the projects that you would plan on funding. So even though the TIP would allow for all those eligible projects to be funded, I think if you put this on the ballot, the best way to approach it would be to identify those projects that would get funded out of the TBD. I know you didn't ask about the regressivity piece. It's a little, and I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that if you want me to address the question Tola asked. It's a little bit of a challenge to do the analysis because the sales tax is spread out and it's paid for by people who don't necessarily live in the community. So those individuals who come to the community and spend taxes here, it may, and we are unable to get the breakdown between how much is paid, how much sales tax is paid from out of city versus in city. Whereas property taxes, 100% of those costs are borne by the people who live here. Even if you're a renter, those costs are going to be passed on to you through higher rents. So to answer the regressivity, in theory, sales tax is slightly more regressive than property tax, but in this case it may not be because of the distribution of how those taxes are collected.
So would it be possible on a ballot measure to say we're trying to fund a $30 million project, and we anticipate using the TBD for just this portion, which would approximately mean $54 a year in sales tax, and even though that would be all sales tax, but is it possible to be that transparent when you go out to the voters with this?
What I envision that we would do would be those projects that were identified to use TBD as a partial funding source for a project would be to use our capital budget format where we have the project detail and it lists all of the different funding sources that would be connected with that project. And then because that might include REIT, it might include some other debt because of the large size of a project, and you may not want to use a certain level of TBD. You would set that as a policy. And so you would have all of those impacts for all of those different sources. So if you were going to use some REIT dollars, it would buy down your REIT fund a certain portion. If you were going to have a grant, that could be a viable source for funding projects as well. And then that portion of the TBD we could get to, because we have to use the state average, because we, as Bob said, we can't pinpoint the actual true impact to a property owner, but we do know that on average that average household pays about $2,400 in sales tax. So if you add in this 0.2% that is identified as a funding source for a transportation benefit district, that's about $51 on average a year in those households. So we can get close to that, but we just cannot get that fine-tune, that minute amount of impact.
So just if we were to go out to the public for a project or two, and it was to use this new TBD, money would only be collected for a certain period of time just for those two projects, and then if you wanted to go back out again with different projects, you'd have to reformulate the whole thing and come back to council again.
The TBD is formed as a special district,
right.
And so it encompasses, for the most part, the corporate limits of the city. So you form that, you identify the transportation improvement plan, the capital budget as your source, which in fact includes the transportation improvement plan. So what you may do then is because the TBD would be looked at as a source to pay the annual debt service. So or you may choose to save it all up and fund a project via cash. But likely, and that's in some of the information about setting a TBD, is that if you choose to use it to pay for debt service, and that means that you would pick projects, you would identify those projects, all of the different funding sources, and utilize then TBD for the payment of the principal and interest. And then there would be another capital budgeting cycle. There may be more new projects, expanded projects, and those projects would have funding sources, and then you would go and you would identify that this portion of these projects is going to be paid for by TBD. The tax would be essentially continue to come in like sales tax does annually. It's just that portion of it would go into a special revenue fund where the council, through their actions, decides to put certain dollars of TBD into a project.
Okay.
I also want to say I hesitated a little bit because I think what you put in the voter's guide pamphlet, you could be as specific and as transparent as you suggested. What I'm not sure is what the ballot language would look like. So, but I think the intent of what would be, clearly identified within that would identify those projects and then what those projects would get funded with.
Right.
So one of the questions I have is just about timing and whether to sort of follow up on what Bill had talked about in terms of having this come right now before budgeting has ended. Could we just talk a little bit about what the timeline is and having this come to council on the 18th? Is it possible to have the public hearing and then have this be something that's discussed along with other ideas and in a different session with the newly elected council?
So I think what Council President Goodman laid out was that this would come back to the council asking for direction. So if the council directed the administration to draft an ordinance and hold a public hearing, that would be done at a completely separate meeting. Somehow this agenda bill needs to be disposed of. So right now it's been sitting kind of in committee. It got referred to this work session, and it has to come back to council. Council could just choose to receive it, do nothing with it, or it could vote to direct the administration to prepare an ordinance and hold a public hearing. In terms of timing, it's really dependent upon what council wants to do with this AB and how to dispose of it.
There's no deadline or anything that's driving this other than that we should. Go ahead.
No, the fact that it is in a budget work session is just a coincidence.
Oh, thank you.
Think of it this way. I'm going to back up from a point in time in the future, say about this time next year or within 60-day window of now, where there might be a vote of the public, item on a ballot at the general election in November, perhaps, and it might be to do be placed there by Transportation Benefit District, and it might be a levy lid lift, or it might be a sales tax increase, and there are some other options there as well, I think, that also require votes of the public. And that actual dollar amount of that will be driven by some selection that this Transportation Benefit District did in terms of selection of projects, using our capital plan, how much of, and all the various funding sources for those projects, how much would be funded by the TBD funds, and that decision of those projects and those amounts will be made some months earlier by the Transportation Benefit District. And prior to that, that Transportation Benefit District will be established, and it has not yet selected what funding mechanism to use. It's just setting up the benefit district. Prior to that, we'll have a public hearing that I think this is where we're talking about, or about 2 meetings from now, or 2 meetings into the future, where there's been notice, there's a public hearing to establish one. They might do these things. Here's the purpose for funds for these type of it would educate, that public hearing would inform people about the purposes of a transportation benefit district, what we envision we might do with it in a time frame, what some of the options are. And prior to that public hearing, there has to be council action to direct the administration to schedule a public hearing and put kind of the framework for a TBD into that bill as well. So the public hearing will be on the TBD and in this type of framework, the boundaries and jurisdiction and all that type of stuff. So this next step is about setting up the organization and its framework. It is not yet deciding what projects or how to fund or what funding mechanism within them. And that will be decided sometime after it gets established, should it get established. And then there will be probably a public hearing about that as well before it's even, if it's a ballot measure one, placed on the ballot. It doesn't have to be a ballot. If the TBD is formed, it could be the car tabs, and doesn't require a vote. So car tabs or a levy lid lift or sales tax, those will be the various things that this organization considers and puts all in context, and if there's a vote of the public, puts it out in front of the vote of the public. So there are multiple options on how it could be funded. The only decision I think would be tonight would be to bring the question back to the full council and directing the city administration to do some work to say, yes, let's put the framework, put it in words, the framework for the TBD, and to schedule a public hearing. And that's what we would be debating. Then how much and what funding source and what type of timing would all come later should that be successful. We're not making decisions on those tonight.
Other questions?
I just want to give Mariah a little more information because you asked about a timing issue. So just to be sure to understand that this, if it had stayed in the infrastructure committee, it would have been coming back to the council in January. But there was a big push and a demand by some council members, and I think somewhat on the administration side as well too, that they thought this needed to be addressed prior to the end of the calendar year. And I don't understand all the reasons on that, except a little bit of a change of council or some other things, but I'm not sure. But that was a big push. And if it stayed in infrastructure, it would have come back in January after the budget was set. But that was a change and a push that there was some determination that was a critical thing to do before the end of the year.
Well, it can't be addressed before the end of the year because it would have to come to the council in December, and if the council decides to move forward and establish a public or set a public hearing, that wouldn't be until January anyway. So I support moving it forward to a regular meeting of the full council, and for us to make a decision at that time about what we want to do with this agenda bill that has been around for a little bit of time. And I'm not. And I agree with Paul that there is a lot of process yet to be had before we ever collect any any money from anyone under a TBD, but I am in forward of moving it forward to have a final decision made on this bill. Mary Lou?
Sure. I'm also in support of moving this forward. I think the first phase of this was to understand what a TBD does, and to suggest that we form one, but not to use it and not to factor it into this year's budget. So we didn't use this in any way predicting any of the funding for any of the projects coming up. But one of the reasons I wanted to move it out of committee was because I didn't have any more questions on what a TBD is. I know what it is. I don't know how Issaquah is going to use it in particular, but I think it's something we ought to have. So I'm in favor of moving it forward and having that public hearing.
Ola?
One final thought. There may well be at some point in the future, if this council gets to a point where we have a package in front of us that's a comprehensive capital plan that includes elements that have a transportation benefit district and that have other potential funding mechanisms, I may at that point enthusiastically support it. But tonight, without having confidence that we're going to consider those other options, I'm going to stick with my no for tonight in the hopes of something comprehensive later.
Any other questions or comments? Paul?
I like the way Mary Lou said it. I agree. I didn't see this as a 2017 budget issue. What we do know in our capital plan is we have unfunded projects. And this is one way to possibly fund them. And that process takes time. I did hear from staff a while ago that if we waited much longer, any chance for a vote of if the route is a vote of the people, we'd have to get started at this part of the process now, even to make next November. And so to me, yeah, we are talking, I don't know, that could be a 3, 6, 9, 12-month slide if we don't do it now. Get the process started to be maybe as early, if it's a vote, as early as next November. And so I agree that it really wasn't this budget. We have a capital plan. We know part of it's unfunded. This is one of the ways that we can address a large part of that. And so that was the timing in my consideration as well.
Mariah?
So it sounds to me that this is really a vote to put this as an option and something that would be looked into and decided on later. I'm very sorry about that. I'll come back in a moment.
Put it on speaker. That's what happens.
Usually I'm really good about
I'm just kidding.
turning that off before I come into the meeting. That was my son, so. So I would be in favor of going forward so this can be a potential option. I'm not sure how I would feel about this when and if this is presented, but I want the ability to have different options in front of us as we take a look at some of these transportation projects. So I'll be supporting this.
Anybody else? Okay, so I'm going to call for the vote, and the thumbs up would mean that you support sending this to the December 18th council meeting, and at that point, the council would just consider whether it wants to direct the administration to establish or to set a public hearing for considering at a later meeting whether we want to establish the transportation benefit district. So thumbs up means it moves forward. 1, 2, 3, go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 to 2. So it will go to the December 18th meeting. Thank you. Next item on the agenda. Oh, it's our last item. How exciting is that? Okay, this is the continuation of our proposed 2018 budget deliberations. And the first item under that is the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee. And
Dutter is with us from ED.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then my understanding is that, I can't remember, there's a reference to an agenda bill in here, but is there an actual agenda bill in here? No. Okay.
I think I just saw it. Yep, here we go. Bear with me, excuse me.
Before we get started, Bob, can you tell us what you're expecting from us tonight? Because I think there's an agenda bill that's coming to be referred. I think it's December 18th to be referred. So the vetting of that agenda bill is not tonight.
Correct.
Okay, and so if you could just clear up for all of us what we're supposed to do tonight, and then I don't think most of us have met this gentleman up here at the podium.
All right, great. So the city has a hotel lodging tax, and part of that requirement under the state law is that there's a we call the LTAC, or Lodging Tax Advisory Committee, and that committee meets at least on an annual basis to provide recommendations on how those expenditures of that tax should be done. And then the city council has two options. They can accept those recommendations and appropriate the money, or they can reject those recommendations, and then essentially it gets kicked back to the LTAC committee for further review or refinement. So this evening, what you'll see is one of the proposals that came out of the LTAC committee, and we're not talking about, you'll see there's a proposal to set up a visitors bureau. We're not talking about setting up that visitors bureau tonight. Essentially, the question for this evening is, what should the appropriation, based on the recommendation, is that appropriation amount okay or not okay? If it's not okay, then it gets kicked back to LTAC. There is a appropriation amount in the budget. Do you have the page number handy by chance? We'll get that. That is currently in there based on anticipated revenues and expenses. Page 71 of the budget. And so Tim Dutter is our new economic development manager, has been with the city for a few months, and he is the staff liaison to the LTAC committee. That committee is made up of, do you cover that in your presentation? I can't remember.
Took it out.
Okay. Made up of two hoteliers, two at-large appointments, and one city council member. That city council member appointee has been Paul Winterstein, so we may be able to have a little bit more information as on your questions as it relates to why the committee ended up choosing this recommended option. So with that, Tim, I'll let you go ahead and do your presentation, and we'll follow up with any additional supplemental information as needed.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. Good evening. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. I've met some of you, but not everybody. So as Bob said, my name is Tim Dutter. I'm the new economic development manager. I've moved here and started on July 3rd. I'm from Wisconsin. Before this, I was the president of the Chamber of Commerce for Beloit, Wisconsin for about 3 years. Before that, I worked in economic development in Colorado Springs for 2 years. So I know you've got a lot on your plate, so I'll try to be brief tonight. Bob kind of covered a little bit of the history of the lodging tax. These are just the mechanics of how the tax works. It's primarily collected by our hotels and motels. In a nutshell, those dollars need to be used towards tourism marketing, operations, anything to do with tourism, and it's here in this slide. Sorry. So how have the LTAC funds been spent in the past? In the past, typically cities have collected the funds and then given them back out to the nonprofits as grants. However, some of the municipalities have gotten in trouble for that because they're not necessarily using those funds for entities or organizations or marketing that pertains to tourism. So according to the Washington state law, that's defined as anybody who's traveling over 50 miles. So the whole goal is to create tourism, to support tourism, and to create hotel stays. So that's what the LTAC in essence is trying to do. And in Issaquah, we have tourism assets. Here's just a few. These are our primary tourism assets and then our diversionary. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with all of these organizations. The Roger Brooks study. So let me take you back to 2015. In 2014, the Chamber of Commerce and the Lodging Taxing Committee hired Roger Brooks. So Roger Brooks is the international expert on tourism to come in to Issaquah and do a review. Bob was a part of that. I don't know who here was. I'm sure some of you remember that, but let me kind of bring you back to it. Roger Brooks basically outlined essentially 11 steps for the LTAC and said this is the process, what you need to do to promote tourism in Issaquah. So fast forward, I came in July, I kind of looked at the study and said, okay, why aren't we doing these things? Why haven't we created the visitors organization, and why haven't we hired a director to run it? So I started to look at kind of the history and how we kind of got here. So little history, little background. In 2015 and again in 2016, the LTAC sought to do this, but they went about it a little bit different angle. They tried to hire an independent contractor, a temporary employee, to kind of do the steps that we're kind of doing now, to start the organization and to start doing that destination marketing for the organization. The RFQs and RFPs received very little response, and I believe that was due to less funding at the time, the message delivery and the structure. If you think about it, if somebody was applying for that job, it's not a full-time job, there's no organization in place, there's no board of directors to report to. So we kind of revisited the Roger Brooks study and said, let's look at it from a different angle. Let's start here. Let's create the visitors organization that's recommended in the study, and then let's go find the director. So what we're trying to do now is create the organization to be a 501c3, a nonprofit. Think of some of our local nonprofits. You have a Chamber of Commerce who works on business to business. You have a downtown association who focuses on the downtown. Another entity operates in a similar manner, but different objective, right? It's to promote Issaquah and destination marketing and people to get visitors to come to Issaquah. So this is kind of what we're trying to do. And then once the organization's in place, we can hire the director to come in and run it. And these are just a few of the things that the director would do. So if you think of what most visitors bureaus do, they coordinate the hotel stay. So they coordinate sports tournaments, they coordinate events, conferences, those types of things. We don't have anybody to do that right now. There's nobody that's really doing all of that for us. So we need someone to come in and kind of help us with that. So the LTAC is basically laying out what that director's budget will look like, and these numbers are fluid. We can move these around a little bit, but just to get started, this is what we're thinking for the salary, the rent, the website, conferences, education, and whatnot. So this can change, but this is kind of a ballpark. And then what we're asking for, the LTAC's asking for, is 180, 150 for that director's budget that you just saw, and then another 30 in startup fees for the attorney fees or any accounting fees. So if you want to know in general what that fund looks like in 2016, it brought in about 180,000. 2017 is projected to be 200,000. So it's somewhere we can be confident that's going to stay around 180. So you still have leftover funds. And down the road, I would hope that some of that money goes back into some of our nonprofits that do promote tourism, and they do have money. So what does that look like now? Well, let me get to the next steps, and we'll come back toward the fun.
Jen can fill in that blank for you in terms of what that number is.
I saw it. Jen got it to me. I just didn't have time to put it in the PowerPoint. It's about, is it 617,000?
Actually, the amount of cash is 587,000 because we have some unpaid bills. So
sure.
587.
So that's a good thing, and that wasn't done by accident. So if you look at the Roger Brooks study, he basically said to wean the nonprofits off of the tax dollars as using them as grant money. And then in their place, they're going to get this organization and a director in that place. So they're looking forward to that. They're kind of waiting on this. But in that meantime, when they went to go do this the first couple times, there wasn't much in the budget. But now those funds have sat, so now they have some money that they can actually use. So it's a good thing. And like I said, it was done intentionally. The next steps, you did see that there's an agenda bill coming on the 18th to be referred to Safety and Services Committee, and we need to hire an attorney to help us implement those articles of incorporation and the bylaws, and then appropriate the funds. So they're asking the council to appropriate the $180,000 to get this organization started. Yeah. This is kind of weird scrolling through slides like this.
Okay, so the AB 7522 would be to refer, and then number 3 is what we're addressing tonight. Where does the authorization for number 2 happen?
In the agenda bill.
Okay, thanks.
I know you guys are about to have some questions.
What's the specific dollar ask for next year?
180,000. 150 for the director's budget and another 30,000 in startup fees.
Stacy?
Yeah.
The current 2018 proposed budget has a $172,000 that is proposed. That's on page 71 of the budget. So the change for the 180 would be an additional $8,000 to add to that particular fund.
And is that on our list, our
Deliberations?
list?
It is not on the deliberations list,
Okay.
but we can certainly add that when we review the current list and where we're at with that.
Yeah. Seems like we should add it to the deliberations list. Paul?
I'd like to add a few more items that may be of interest to the council. The organization would be a completely separate entity. It wouldn't be run, it wouldn't be part of the city organization. It'd be a separate nonprofit. We, the city, our investment, the LTAC funds aren't ours, right? They're collected. We're the keeper and the distributor, but they're not our funds. There's Tim's time. There's any legal services time, and then we always have a council member on the LTAC commission, and the structure of a destination marketing organization, which this Visit Issaquah would be, which that's just the name for something generally known as a DMO. Tim as a staff liaison, council member who is the chair of that committee, it'd be their time as well. They'd be part of the board of this DMO, which is this separate nonprofit organization. So, and then finally, there is also, potentially other resources. I think from a council's fiduciary responsibility, is about those resource demands. And kind of the general purpose. Now, I think there's also Brooks also recommends, LTAC has 5. He suggests 3 or 4, probably 4 more for a board of 9, excuse me. And one of the items we might want to discuss is what would be the city's role in helping shape, the final, the board. And so those are some of the other things that would be discussed as part of this agenda bill process. It would be an entity separate from anything that exists today and separate from the city, totally funded by LTAC.
Questions? So if we can add that, add the $8,000, I guess.
I have a question about
Sure.
8. So if we're referring the bill into January and looking at formation partway through the year, do we really need to put the whole 180 over there right now? Or is it possible just to leave it at 172 because it's not forming on January 1st, it's forming a few months later, or a month later?
Yes.
Could just leave it. Okay.
So if it's not on the deliberations list and there's 172 in the proposed budget, does any of that money get spent unless, does that money get spent even if the agenda bill is not adopted?
So since there were no adopted program other than form the DMO, it won't get spent until you get the agenda bill. That would come back, and then the council would have the opportunity to make that decision. So sometimes you'll see other projects in there. Since there were no other proposed projects, there's no other funds, except potentially we sometimes charge a portion of staff time to that fund, to the LTAC. So that's one that would probably continue depending on the amount of staff time involved.
Ola?
Can I ask one question about, in the salary that you've got for director, you've got 180. Is that in any way prorated because that person's not going to be around January 1st? In other words, is it prorated, and if not, what would the 2019 number be?
It's not prorated. Those funds would probably just go back into marketing dollars. And the way that we came up with that number was looking at other nonprofits and directors in the region that have similar roles. That's where we got the 75 to 85 for the salary.
And that would be full-time?
Yes.
So if there's nothing on the deliberations list, then it would just, the budget would have $172,000 in it for next year. Everybody okay with that? Or do you want to put something on the deliberations list? Oh,
Just add a comment to the, as happens every year, when the original budget document puts together, LTAC hasn't met yet and made its recommendation for the budget. So I think we did pretty good just being within 8,000 of what the original kind of plug number that was put in there based upon previous year's spends. But that's how that happens, is the budget's put together before LTAC comes together with the full plan.
And just to reiterate, this is all LTAC funding, and it's the only thing it can be spent on is this type of work. And so it's do this or try to come up with some other type of project, right? Thank you.
okay. Okay, well, seeing no more discussion, do you have anything else for us, Tim?
No, if you know any good candidates down the road and you see the RFP come out, encourage them to apply.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So the next, it looks to me, Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, the next one is additional information provided in response to questions from council.
Yes, we've got a Q&A on the ICTV coverage.
So on page 73, I had asked for some sort of a cost estimate for televising the remaining commissions that aren't already, and there was several pages of significant information, and which had a certain character to it. So I guess my question for Bob is, which I mentioned, I think, to council in a sort of a preview of the meeting tonight, and I've mentioned it to you, and I think I mentioned it before. I anticipated the answer to be we need more study, and indeed, in addition to lots of other information, it says analysis on whether there's more analysis needed. So what kind of money do you think would be necessary for us to look a little more at what is possible for more televising, space, recommendations on what we could do?
Yeah, if you look at page 75 and 76 of tonight's agenda,
Yep.
there's got the cost information that's included within that on the estimate to provide the service. So the top part would be kind of the capital costs, and then the
No, just for additional work to come up with some sort of
I
a,
understood your question to be
Yeah,
different.
little different.
This information provided what it would cost to do the type
Yeah.
of service that we provide today and outfit 2 rooms and provide the staffing that's needed to televise in the manner that we do today. I don't know what additional funding would be necessary to look at alternative proposals. What I can tell you is that our communications staff did outreach to at least one company that does video production, and that's reflected in the contracting cost that you see in this response.
so we don't know how much it would cost to even dig a little more and come up with some sort of a recommendation and about how we could maybe even advance a little bit more next year. I mean, I don't know that there's where we are now, and then there's all the way to 14 meetings, all of them televised, all of them in high-tech, wonderful quality. I mean, I think there's a spectrum there, and so I'm troubled a little bit by it's either all or nothing, and it's super crazy expensive. It just feels like oh my gosh, no, we can't possibly do this. And so I'm just asking what we could do to put in a little bit of money to look at it a little more closely. So
I think it would be helpful to understand what sort of outcomes council is looking for. For us, since we get complaints even today about the quality of the video and the ability to see things on screen, is to understand, do you want to maintain the type of quality that we have today, or something less, or something better desired? That kind of input would be helpful for us to go and do the research you're asking for. And then we gave you the full enchilada, right?
Yep.
So then understanding if there's particular boards or committees that you'd want, the ask was to find out what it would cost for all. So if fewer is desired, then we can scale back accordingly. Most of the cost reduction would be, of course, in staff hours as opposed to the equipment, because if we're going to cover any more meetings, I think we're anticipating that we'd have to outfit a different room, since this one is almost fully booked.
So Tola, what I had asked is, we have the all or nothing proposal in here, and so I had asked, what can we do to maybe put in a little money to study a little bit more next year about how we might be able to incrementally do some more. And what that some more is, I'm not sure. And so that's where we left off.
Yeah, and I don't know that you need more funds necessarily to study it, but I think what this does is kind of provide the tail end of that. So if the council came back and said, what we'd really like to do is just televise these 3 meetings, then certainly this is for 2 locations. You could probably get by with 1 location that would cut some of the capital costs, and then we'd have to determine what the cost would be on the operating piece. But it's certainly, we started with trying to answer the question, which is like all meetings. And so if you just dial it back from there, that would be certainly like a report or something we could do in the upcoming year if that was
sure.
desire.
And I didn't have the answers, which is why I asked the question the way I did. And so I think there's more that needs to be done. And so to look at it, and if it doesn't take funds to do that, but it takes staff time, and I would be interested in that. I want to look at it some more, and I don't know whether it takes more money in the budget. I know there was anyway, I don't need to go there. Mary Lou?
Sure. So I think it's good to know what televising all of them would be, using our current technology, our current expectations. I think for me, I'm interested in, we didn't used to televise committees, and now we do. I think that was a big step forward. I think next year with the park strategic plan out in the public, I think doing parks meetings would be really helpful. I noticed on there that some groups are meeting twice a month, and so there's 24 meetings, I think, for 2 of the groups. So I think crafting some sort of policy language that says where we draw that line might be a good idea. Everything on that list wasn't compelling to me, although it may be to others. But definitely parks for next year would rise to that bar, and I would like to see what it would cost to televise those. As well, I think some of the data in there which averaged and presented a summary or an average of how many people might have watched a movie or a video of a meeting, and then I just go through and I scroll around, I look at some planning policy meetings where they're talking about visions or other meetings, and I see 65 people watching. If we had 65 people in the room, we'd be jumping for joy. So we tend to get 5 to 10, 12, on a good night, 40. But 65 more eyes on it, I think, and granted maybe a dozen or less are staff or council going back to rewatch something, I think it's big. So I guess the one question I would have is that having your own television channel was a great thing decades and decades and decades ago. It seems we're in the television channel mode right now, and I guess one question I'd like to know next year is that something we should be doing, or should we be doing some other form of streaming our meetings or having videos for our meetings and having our own TV station, TV channel set up? So I'd kind of like to know a little bit more about that question next year, and I'd like to see parks meetings next year.
Paula?
So the total for everything would be $208,000, right? So right now, we don't have this on the deliberation list. Is that correct?
Correct.
I would like to have us consider putting it on the deliberation list.
Okay. Other questions? Bill?
Just the other one is mentioned things that are important. Just comment, I think Urban Village Committee is probably going to be on its way out as we close out those agreements. And transportation is a new one coming on. So I think that would be a very important one. So that one might be able to just slip in and trade that slot from what Urban Village is, and transportation could slip in there as a nice filler. And then looking at the calendar, then just briefly, it's just kind of looks like there's 1 or 2 nights now that could be a Wednesday or 2 Wednesdays possibly that could add a meeting or so. And I think Parks, as you mentioned, Mary Lou, is a good one. And so that might be able to fit in with the current structure. If we trade transportation in there and add Parks, I think we could do that and have just exactly what we have with a little bit more, without a lot of expense except staff time.
Mariah?
I would agree that I think it's just a really good idea to make some headway. So I'm glad that this has been added to deliberation, and I would be really supportive of seeing Parks and Transportation there, and maybe we choose one other group and just make some headway in terms of more having this televised.
So it's on the deliberations list, so we'll be talking about that again. Next is last gen here. Can't really tell what we need to talk about before we get. So the next item in the attachments is budget highlights. Jen, I'm going to let you tell us what's next because I'm not positive.
Well, budget highlights, this is the list, the master list of deliberation items. And so we're going to add in the information about the televising, and we're going to add in the 8,000. So what I'm going to do, and I put in the agenda packet, was the latest. The items on the right-hand side of this sheet are conversations that the council has had at previous work sessions, and I'm going to just see if I can get this so it can be seen. This information here on the very right-hand side was either notes as to why or what happened, and this was the poll that was taken. So you can see that we have gotten through some discussion items on the list of topics. So I wanted to provide that where we're at from the last budget work session.
May I make a suggestion? So is this for the deliberation purposes?
It is their deliberations list where we're tracking what they want to have a conversation about.
I know there had been a request to kind of highlight the new IT fund. Mm-hmm. Should we do a quick presentation on that and come back to this?
That's
okay,
what I was going to suggest.
Sorry, thank you.
So if we were to flip to, this is kind of a quasi Q&A, a response to additional information. In the agenda packet, you would see on page 85 is some information, and John is also here to walk us through the changes as we shifted from IT cost throughout a number of funds, throughout a number of line items. We shifted that into a new internal service fund under our cost allocation policy, and that there's some other information that I'll go through with regards to our financial management policy, the cost allocation section in the budget. But we first wanted to go through what this fund changes, and you can find this fund in summary form in the budget on page 112 and 113. And so, John, would you like to walk through there's 3 slides that talk about the internal service fund, and I'll bring those up if that's okay with the council.
John Traeger, IT manager. So at the last time we gathered about this topic, there seemed to be some clarity needed about how the internal service fund works. So this first slide is how it works. So on the left are the current or the department budgets, excluding IT. On every department, they will have a line item that's a technology services charge. That then gets into the technology services fund, and then that is spent out of the technology services fund. So it's not in the budget twice. It's just a charge. It shows up as a charge in each department, goes into a fund, and then gets spent out of that fund. So any questions about how the service fund works? So there's a cost allocation model, which I'll show you in a minute.
Well,
go ahead.
Maybe it's the model that you're going to show, but so I kind of got that. So there's some sort of a formula that determines what amount from each department's budget will be utilizing IT.
Right.
And that money funds IT.
Correct.
So what about the formula for figuring out?
So it has 2 components to it. One is a department that has an application that only they use. So say the police have a particular application to run their dispatch. So that is charged wholly to them because it's not shared across the city. So there's a huge worksheet that has all this stuff on it, but there's one that's just in department expenses. So there's specific projects they're doing that only they use in their department. They'd get charged for that. That goes into that expense that service charge. And then there's another page that is all the citywide support systems. So email, network, internet, printers, the list goes on, as well as the staff, IT staff. So then that is just divided by the number of, or percentage of the city staff that department has. So there's like a head tax, if you will, that covers the citywide IT expenses.
And are all of those, on the first one, so I'll use the police as an example, when you said dispatch.
Right.
So are all of those systems that are charged, for lack of a better word, to IT, are all of those systems serviced by the city?
Yes. So IT is already supporting all these systems. And some cases they're cloud-based, so there's not a lot of IT support, but it's still a technology cost. And we want to run that all through the service fund because, and I'll show you in the last slide, it's a process so we can get a better overall view of our technology as a city and try to align purchases to the technology strategy that the council would like to see going forward. Because we haven't done that historically. It's been, I'm in a department, I want a thing, I have money, I'm going to buy it. And it's led to a really complicated portfolio, which is hard to manage from an IT staffing perspective. So we're trying to, this is also a method to control a portfolio better and get better alignment with the overall strategy.
So one of the, I saw somewhere a few weeks back, maybe when we first presented this information, but I don't know where it is. I guess I understand police dispatch and their special system. I think I saw somewhere long-range planning had like a big number, like $750,000 or something. And I wondered why that would be so big.
Long-range planning? You're talking about a budget software, maybe?
I don't know where I saw it, but there was some big allocation.
DSD? So there's so I'll go to the next slide, maybe that'll help a little bit. Go ahead.
Sure. I think I recall the number that you're talking about, and what I would tell you is don't don't think too much about which division it's shown in. Think about it at the department level.
Right.
Because it may have existed in a department budget or been charged in a place in a department budget that is not the perfect spot for it to be charged, but it's a department cost. So I think if you can talk about what systems DSD has that service all units of DSD, that would be a more appropriate answer.
Okay, then that's fine. I don't need another, that makes more sense.
So moving from.
Can you
well,
go back
ahead.
to the other slide?
Sure.
Thanks. So each year going forward now, DSD, Parks and Rec, and Police will have a line item in the order of $600,000 to $800,000 a year.
Correct.
So that is the cost of buying software, maintaining software, and using the staff time that we have in the IT department.
And projects that they wanted to do. So this first year is a transition, and so, you know, they said, here's the things we plan to do next year and buy, you know. So in finance's case, they, you know, there's a capital size stuff, but there could be smaller projects, right, where it's under the CIP threshold, but they want to do a thing. So that's going to be on their expense. That'll change from year to year, depending on the project. So, so that's that can be variable, but that sits on top of the base cost, which is the head tax, the PC replacement, servers, and all that stuff that's really organizational.
Okay. And then you're building a reserve, so the cost allocation raises 3.9 million, and then you only spend 3.5 million. What does that reserve pay for in the future?
So the reserve is, think of it like the fleet reserve you have for vehicles to smooth out the cost. So typically in a fund that's supplying hardware, you would have a reserve like that.
Okay, so we would have years maybe where you're going to show the reserve balance in a negative.
Probably not, but you want to build it up so that when you need to get something, it doesn't drop, you know, create a sudden spike. Because some of the stuff you buy, you know, in 3-year intervals or something, it doesn't all happen at once, so you got to save up money for it through the fund.
And the IT charges that the public pay are included in this. Is that one of the reasons why you have a reserve, because DSD charges a technology fee and Parks and Rec might charge a technology fee? Is that why how you're generating a reserve, or?
The reserve really comes out of just the expenses charged to the departments. The revenue from the say permit tech fees, that is in there as far as on the revenue side.
Okay, thanks.
So how would, you know how I've wanted to look at things over the years, right? Which is the sort of the real cost over time. How would I do that here? Like, I see a total of 3.5 million, so I get that that's what we spent. But like, as I look at the 2017 budget, and I look at information technology in the 2017 budget, I clearly must not be comparing apples to apples, because it was $1,065,000.
Right, you can't. That's the problem. It was spread out amongst all the departments. So on this next slide, I try to illustrate how that it's challenging to bring it in, but this way we will have going forward clean year-to-year comparison of technology expense. It's one of the reasons for the exercise, is to do this and run it through a single fund so that we can see what everybody's doing and we can make decisions about it strategically instead of tactically, which has essentially been the past. So on the far left, you have this year's budget. And how do we bring it over? You can see there's the funds that you talked about, which is the IT fund currently, $17. And then you've got the capital fund stuff, which that moves over, that we currently have for PCs and server replacement. And then you have other department budgets. And there's the same category of funds coming across. But the way they had used it, they didn't really code things the same way. So there's a bunch of weird moving around, but it's all the same. And it took quite a while just to try to hunt down all their technology expenses, you know, trying to do it by vendors that look like technology, like interviewing people in the departments. So I think I captured it all, but it was quite an exercise to get it. And then bring it over to build the budget. So that's essentially what we did, is we built the budget off what we could find that were technology expense that were elsewhere in all those different funds for each department. And then, so that's the middle one. It shows the components coming in that kind of made up this year's budget. And, the resolution on this is terrible, but you should be able to see it on your PDF. And then the right side is the final budget with, the normal funds you would expect in an IT fund.
Follow-on question. So you can go back one page. So this is extremely helpful. The way I look at this is if you take, there's sort of two ways to look at it. You can say what's salaries and operating and look at that per capita, or you can say total per capita. And the salary and operating per capita is about $8,500 per capita, and the all in is about $13,500. And that's well within what one would expect if one takes IT out as a I don't want to say profit center, because you're not operating as a profit center, but I mean that's well within what I see out in the private sector. So if somebody were to ask me, is IT right-sized, I can say, yeah, that 85, not counting the capital stuff, is actually, and I have no idea how that compares to Kirkland or Redmond or any of those places, but I know how it compares to private industry.
So it's
and given that we have, I'm sorry?
It's significantly less than the surrounding cities. And the difference is I have a lot of lines of business, and I have 700 applications to cover. With, it's just a much more complex environment. So the private sector, it's hard to be apples to apples on that per capita number, though I have looked at it. Trying to get there, but again, our portfolio is really complicated.
And the fact that you've got mission critical apps like the Parks and Recreation app, which if it doesn't work, we can't do our core business at all. So anyhow, this allows me to feel comfortable about where we're at from IT is the punchline. So thank you.
Okay, and then I just had one last slide, which is just kind of iterating these points. This does line up with a new financial policy to do cost allocation. It is a vehicle for portfolio management to give you an overview year on year where we're spending technology. We have a IT governance committee, but they've really been about solutions. Now they're going to be about alignment for technology purchases. So as we go into the next budget cycle, they're going to have to weigh in on their projects and compete across the organization for funding instead of just within their own little funds. And then that overview will help us do cost containment in general there's a lot of things I think we could do to reduce our support costs if we had more uniform platform.
So a couple questions overall. So you talked about the head tax. So you take basically all your costs and figure it out, come up with a number, and then the department has the 10 FTEs pays half of what a department has 20 FTEs. You've kept it very simple, correct? Okay. All right. And if I'm reading this correctly, then all your capital costs is also in here, so you wouldn't be having things in the CIP because they'd be covered under this program, right?
Capital for hardware, software, that type of stuff, which is right now in the fleet fund, it would be in this. But then the large software projects, it's more than a $50,000 commitment, or whatever the new threshold is, that would come before you as it has in the past. So those are above and beyond projects. Somebody wants to buy a giant mega app to run, I don't know, pick a department. We'd bring that to you guys because that's a major investment. That goes outside of what is shown here for the budget. Okay,
and then so you're building up a reserve of $500,000. So the first year,
well, it's 50
almost close to
right now.
Close to
50,000 right now.
Is it?
I think it was 50,000 on there, wasn't it?
465,000. Close to $500,000 there.
What page is that?
The other way. 3.5 and 3.
Oh, okay, you're right. Sorry.
Yep, so close to $500,000. So this first year, folks are paying a dear price, if you will, not their actual cost. Now, next year, do you plan to include another $500,000 of reserve adding to that, or is that reserve kind of a one-time thing and next year people do, so you just keep adding to that?
Well, I'll defer, but I think it's to get it started, and then it probably won't be the same scale.
If I could, I'd like to walk through the 2018 budget. That was one of our planned reviews with the council. What you see here is an expanded line item detail budget for 2018 for the new internal service fund. What I wanted to point out here is that this is, when we wanted to compare and tell what has changed for the council, this is all funds in the 2017 amended budget. This is the projected ending year-end balance. So what I wanted to show was on the revenue side here, we've got in 2017, we've currently have the DSD, the 5%, the tech fee. And so that's really the only type of revenue for IT that's coming into all funds, all departments, in all budget line items. And so the comparison then for the new internal service fund is the current tech fee, the proposed tech fee, and then these are the new internal service fund charges that go out to, they charge the direct service fund, the departments, for their share of the cost of that general information technology expenditures. And what John indicated is the amount for a specific application or specific cost that they have asked for. And the methodology then used for IT-related expenditures is typical, and that is based on the user in the department. So this is the revenue side. I just wanted to note the corrected amount that was published in the 2018 budget. The 2018 budget is 3.964942 in revenues coming in. Then on the expenditure side, we broke down the salaries and benefits to show that in all funds, all departments, however it had been budgeted for in the past, was this $837,000. We anticipate being over, and again, this is in a number of different funds, so it's hard to compare the apples to apples. But in the 2018 budget, you'll find a proposed salary and benefits of $1.2 million. The total change then from the 2017 to 2018 budget is about $365,700. This is broken down then for the annual adjustments, the benefit premium, and contractual obligations for existing staff of about $62,000. The proposal is to transfer an FTE from the general fund to the internal service fund. This is coming from DSD. That cost is approximately $138,000. And then there's a proposed new position for the ERP solutions architect, and that estimated cost is $166,000. So that makes up the difference in personnel and benefits of $365,700. Then we go down to the operating costs. The total amount for 2018 is a little over $1 million, comparable to 2017 overall for those operating line items, and you can see those there, is about $1.3 million. So operating costs are intended to overall propose to go down. Then we look at the professional services category. In 2017, we have approximately $103,000 in professional services. The 2018 proposed budget is to go up primarily for the Munis implementation. This is an ongoing ERP as part of our solution. That's where professional services category is proposed to go up. Then you've got the capital portion of the budget, because this is a budget that's contained in itself. So it's like a business or an enterprise fund where you have all salaries, benefits, operating costs, and the capital costs. And so this is a breakdown then of the projects that are identified in the 5-year CIP under the technology category. There is $661,000 that is proposed for budget software, the continued Munis ERP, and the recreation software. Last year, we had approximately $440,000 in capital projects related specifically to technology. Then we go into the equipment category of the 5-year CIP, and those are what John talked about was the PC replacements and the server replacements, and that is about the same from one year to the next. And then you see the capital outlay, which is different from capital projects because of the threshold, below $50,000. And there is a combined proposed ask of $130,000 for those equipment enhancements for a total capital proposal of over $1 million. That compared to 2017's capital outlay for technology improvements of a little over $650,000. So in 2017, the total overall budgets from all funds again, all line items, are almost $3 million. For 2018, the proposal is about $3.5 million. That overall increase of 571 is due to those staffing and benefit increases. It's a combination of reductions in IT operating costs, but increases in the capital investments in our systems for approximately $205,000. The ending fund balance is essentially that new reserve that over time will work to smooth out the cost of those replacement charges that departments are, those standard charges for those PC replacements. And so that's why when we start to develop a reserve fund for an internal fund where we've got a replacement plan, that's where the IT governance committee will work on what are we going to use those funds for. And so this is a breakdown of 2018 compared to 17, and be happy to answer any more questions of the council.
Sure. Finish, because I asked the question and I'm not sure I got the answer. So my question was, there's almost $500,000 they're put in reserve, and the question was, that's a plan your first year to do that. Now, what is the plan next year? Do you need another $500,000 in reserve and you're going to keep building up that reserve account, or is that a one-time shot? $500,000 is all you need to balance that out, and after this you'll go more on a direct cost because you're adding, if it's a one-time thing, of an extra $500,000 to a budget 1 year. So I'm trying to figure out why we're doing that.
So it really funds the depreciation of certain equipment. So where some of this was before was in the fleet fund, which is on page 115. But for example, the Munis system, when we bought that, we essentially took the estimated life of that, and then we put in 1/10, say it's 10 years, I don't remember off the top of my head, but 1/10 of that estimated replacement cost into that reserve fund on an annual basis. So what I would anticipate here is we do the same thing for those major expenses. We would fund the depreciation of those over time so that when it came time to buy that equipment, which is the same way we handle other kind of fleet equipment, we would have those funds available in the reserve to pay for that. So we do that now. It's not a new philosophy. It's just something that it's just in a different account. So again, if you look at fleet services, if you look at that page, for example, that's a proposed expenditure in 2018 of $2.7 million. The overall fund has $10,396,000 in it. So that variance, that $8 million variance, is reserved to pay for the depreciation of all those pieces of equipment. So on an annualized basis, they would do an appropriation if we're buying, a new backloader or a new police vehicle or whatever, that would come out of that reserve for that fleet fund because we take the depreciation over time. So squad car, for example, we do over 3 years. We put that little bit in that account every year to replace that, and then when that vehicle comes due, we've got the cash, and that ends up being the annual appropriation. So the same would be true in the IT fund. I can't tell you if it's going to be $500,000 a year going forward or not. I think that's what you're hearing the team say, is they'll evaluate that, and then that may be adjusted going forward based on what the final expenses would be.
Okay, because I understand how to build a reserve fund. That's I'm just trying to figure out what the goal of that reserve fund is if you're trying to balance that out. Because like I say, you got to replace these things and all that kind of stuff. And I know that comes in it. You're going to have those on cycles, and so hopefully as you do that, if these are 3-year cycles, they're going to be that's just part of the budget that's going to be there every 3 years, right? 5 years for whatever other piece. Understand that. I'm trying to figure out how much you need in reserve for this department to do that, and how you came up with this $500,000, and if that's going to change, increase, or decrease in next year's budget, because it's a big chunk of funds 1 year. It's a big percent to throw into a reserve fund in 1 year for these departments to come up with that additional funding. So I'm just asking that.
Bob, do we have it in a policy somewhere that that's what we would use this being fund balance for, as a reserve to cover capital?
So I'm waiting for Jen to try and find the page, but it's no different than our current practice is what we're doing on this. You're asking me a specific question on the dollar amount, and right now off the top of my head, I don't know what that amount would be.
I think he's asking different questions. One's he's asking for a capital, he's asking for a capital plan that drives this number, which then drives.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
The money, how much you put in that fund.
So I'm bringing that up for a couple of reasons, and thanks for explaining that for me. But we had quite a discussion the other night in turf fields. And the initial thing was not to put enough money in there to replace them at the end of their life cycle. And we then said, no, we should put the full amount in there to replace them, so we have that, right? And so I'm asking, if it sounds like that's the general philosophy, and I'm wondering why that was not at that point. So if we're building up reserves to pay for big capital items, and we set them up that when they're done, we have the money when we buy replacement or what we need to do, I'm just looking for consistency on that and how much that would be.
In the budget, it refers to the financial management policy. It's on page 125 of the budget, section 2.6, reserve targets for internal service funds. The identified number is approximately 30% of a fund's operating budget, and so that is something that we're working towards to achieve in our newest internal service fund. And so with new policy, this is our step in that direction, like I'd indicated in my memo, to comply with federal grant laws as well as state laws. And then we also have the Issaquah financial management policy that also helps to guide where those reserve dollars sit and at what levels.
So doing the math quickly, if you're saying you're looking for a 30% reserve fund and you have a $3.5 million project, then that's a $1.2 million approximately reserve fund you're trying to build to with the first step at $500,000.
Potentially.
Potentially. That's trying to get to that. Thank you.
Follow up on one of Bill's questions. I thought Bill asked whether or not if equipment purchases for IT were showing up here, if they then would not show up in our capital improvement plan. And I think they do still show up.
Yes, they would always still show up in your capital improvement plan. This is, when you look at the budget, or the spending authority, they also show up here. So CIP is the planning document. They're going to show up there. They're going to have council scrutiny on what the capital budget entails. This is just picking that year one and putting it into the spending authorization. And this were the projects that are in the 18 through 22 CIP.
Back to the reserve fund. Are those funds restricted at all? Because they're not all equal dollars going in. John, you explained your formula earlier about department-only systems versus those that are normalized across the entire organization. So are they restricted? They're just or are they available for any purpose going forward?
Well, those funds are
The reserve fund.
Well, in the fund balance designation for an internal service fund, they're not necessarily in the category or fund designation called restricted.
Lowercase r, just in general.
Yes.
I mean, DSD is putting in a certain proportion that's going to end up there, and other organizations less. Is it just now just a general reserve fund?
Yes.
That's what I'm wondering.
These dollars are committed to information technology.
Other questions? Ready to move on?
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Okay, that was the last of the presentation, so I'm just going to circle back to the deliberations list. But what I want to do is I want to actually pull up the spreadsheet because so that you can see real-time ads. And then I also want to pull up the actual tracking tool. And this is how we can see where we're at with changes that the council makes. So this is that same spreadsheet that you just saw, and what I wanted to do was add the cable, the televising of the 208 under the maintenance and operations category.
That was Tola who requested inclusion, by the way.
Okay. Okay. So one of the methods that we were using to go through the deliberations list was the based on policy questions. So I want to bring those back up so that we can take a look at where we were at. The list of potential policy questions for the council to use as we work through the deliberations list is here. There were 9 questions. Previously in work sessions, the council had discussions on questions 1 through 4. So if we wanted to start off with question number 5, that would be the next one. Is that agreeable to the council?
Sure, might as well go down to the next number.
Okay.
I've got a question first, though. Question 4 was 2 questions. I don't know if we got to the second half of that question, or the second question within question 4.
Oh, I see what happened. Question 5 got
Number of these are 2 questions in one or more.
Thank you. Actually, question 5 is this question right here. Shall the city add new positions to address service level demands and incur the ongoing costs of those positions? So thank you. Yes, thank you very much.
Awesome.
I'm going to bring back up then the deliberations list, and I'm going to bring up the staffing section, and I'm just going to very quickly run through the staffing that had been proposed. Was police officers, communications supervisor, change in police administrative assistant hours, change in PWO emergency preparedness coordinator hours, new accountant, new ERP solutions architect, change in the neighborhood engagement coordinator hours, and then a different use of or an addition for stormwater maintenance FTE that was being managed through overtime. So those are the new positions that refer to that question number 5.
Okay. We have 7 questions. Where would you like to start? We have seven questions. Correct. Under the actual positions.
Yes.
Okay.
If you wanted to go by line item, or you wanted to go by, you can see here department-wise, they're identified here for the police department, the different funds that they would impact.
Jen, I have a general question. So these are 7 positions, but there were also changes in staffing, FTEs moving from department to department too, correct? Because the total changed more like 12?
That's correct.
I have that number written down. Okay.
Well, for example, in the new internal service fund for IT, the proposal is to shift 1 FTE from the general fund DSD department to the new internal service fund for information technology. So there are some shifts at play as well.
You want to start at the top? Okay. Number 25. proposal is to add 3 police officer positions.
That's correct.
And to fund them.
And to fund them.
Questions? Comments? Mary Lou?
I have comments. So the chief has been here quite a few times showing us data for this, and I honestly admit I don't have a good understanding of this yet. I think the presentation said that based on the data we saw, adding 3 new positions would just keep us at the service level we have now. I'm still confused about a lot of that. I'm not comfortable approving. I am comfortable approving the positions. I'm not comfortable approving the funding until services and better explain to the rest of us how this all works. It seems I didn't see all the information I needed to see to make me comfortable that this is a good idea.
I think, did you have your, I think Bill and then Tola.
Yeah, I want to look a little more general before we get into positions, because I just look back and trying to put a framework around this. And in 2016 and 17, his last 2 years, according to my calculations, if I didn't make a mistake, we added 24 positions, and this year 7 more. So I'm just trying to keep a framework that looks 31 new positions in the last 2 years and then this year going forward. So I'm trying to just keep that in perspective because as I think was totally brought up earlier, our cost per resident is seeming to go up as well. So I'm just keep an eye on number of positions and our cost per resident for all our overall work. My number here went up from 6.87 to 7.23 expenditures per capita. Are increasing. So I just want to have that big overall picture when we're talking about staffing as well. And then talking about police officers in general, I want to build on what you said, Mary Lou. Scott's been here a couple times, and I asked him directly, excuse me, twice, will these positions add traffic enforcement? Because 2 of them say they're for traffic enforcement. And he specifically answered that question as a no. So I'm highly concerned because his excuse or his explanation was this: he would draw officers off as needed, as he does now with the current traffic enforcement officer when they're needed for other things. And so with the addition of traffic enforcement officers, making it 3 versus 1, and the answer of this would not increase traffic enforcement, which is our biggest concern, that doesn't give me any justification to add new positions. And my fear is that we will go back to a big push on additional traffic cameras, red light cameras, also various cameras in the city, because that's been a push in the past. And my push is I'd rather have traffic officers than cameras. I think they're much more effective and they get you what you want in the long term, which is change in human behavior. And I'm afraid of approving these and then shortly, because they won't be doing traffic enforcement, there'll be another pushback for traffic cameras, and we'll be paying for traffic officers and traffic cameras and not getting the results we want. I am totally for the concept of getting more traffic enforcement officers and dealing with that, but for what the information I have now, I can't support that.
Tola?
So if something is going to come back to services with a request for additional information, I would like to ask Councilmember Pauley if she would put together her thoughts on what sort of additional information she would like, because I will say that I personally feel like I have a more clear idea why the officers are being asked for. So additional information would help me in services.
I can write it, but I can also just speak to it a little bit tonight. One of the things that I had wanted to see was how much time we're spending on overtime versus regular time for the officers, which I didn't see. And also the other piece was there was a shift where, I don't know what year it was, so many years ago we switched and created a new officer level. I don't know what it was called, but we took patrolmen and we changed the category. And I wanted to see how that affected citations, because the citations have gone down by 2/3, and trying to understand who stopped doing traffic enforcement. Didn't see that either. So I really don't have a good picture of of all of those pieces to understand that doing this will get the outcome that we want, which is more boots on the street, more people out during rush hour, and not just counting citations, but seeing real change. Like really seeing that people who are going into south of Sunset to cut off that light are getting ticketed or stop the behavior, because the behaviors are getting worse. I just don't have confidence that just this plan here of 3 more officers, maybe they do traffic, maybe they don't do traffic. I don't understand how we got where we got. So just throwing 3 more bodies at it doesn't give me a lot of confidence that this is going to solve the big issue out there.
Okay, that helps me
But
understand.
I can write down, I can put more stuff.
No, I mean, that helps me understand your concerns. Well, it does get to my second point, which is Bill said traffic enforcement is our largest concern. Respectfully, that's not my largest concern. My largest concern is the increase in overall property crime rate in the city, and the fact that I think people feel less safe around their property. I think that we have specific places where people speed, and I would like to see solutions to people speeding, but I'm not ready to say that. I mean. The statement was made that it is our largest concern, and it is not my largest concern. Mine, again, is around property crime. Thanks.
So I would agree with the comments about not quite understanding what we are getting, what outcomes we are trying to get with 3 additional officers. And I would be in support of 3 positions and not funding at this time. I think we have several issues, and I don't know that I want to, I mean, just overall safety is, I think, typically a city's #1 concern, and how everything else falls out of that in terms of safety. Yeah, I don't know which one is the #1 concern, but I think we have a number of concerns. We're hearing a significant about parking issues and non-response. I would say non-responses in terms that are not satisfying people. We're hearing property crimes. We're hearing about traffic enforcement, and I am not satisfied. I have not been satisfied so far that I know that that I'm comfortable that we're going to be in a different place if we were to have 3 extra officers, and we can't seem to hire them anyway. So I don't think that not funding them right now is a problem, because we can't even get fully staffed. We've been trying to get fully staffed for years. So I think getting a little additional clarity before funding, #1, I need that, and #2, I don't think it's a problem or a detriment, because we haven't been able to hire them anyway. Anybody else? Mariah?
Well, I think it's a larger conversation about how we go about looking at the staffing for a department, and because of recruiting or retention that we would be thinking about not going forward with positions to be at full head count, because we're having problems with recruiting or the timing with that. So I have a concern around that in general, and I think that needs to be a bigger conversation. I guess the other concern that I have is it's sounding like what is maybe lacking here is just a really good picture of those 3 officers and getting towards some of the issues that have been talked about on council. But I also have a concern with not funding the 3 FTEs. If we're talking about maintaining a level of service, does that mean then that our level of service goes down from where we're at right now? So I have concerns around a lot of this in terms of not going forward with the funding, but it does sound like there could be better information that could come out that could help define what those 3 FTEs would be doing.
Others? Last call. Okay.
Procedural question for you then? Is there two questions
Yeah,
here?
that's just what I was going to say. It's, with head nods, I would think there would be two questions just because of the comments, and one would be whether to approve the 3 positions, and then and if that answers yes, then whether to fund the 3 positions. Those seem to be the 2 questions. Does anybody disagree with that? Okay.
Sorry, I have
Yeah.
a question. So whether to approve and then whether to fund, meaning that if we were to go forward with approval, that we could have a larger discussion around the funding, and it could be something where more information could come forward.
So
is that correct?
I would think that it would go like this. If the council had a thumbs up for approving 3 additional positions, but not the funding, then if the council so wished, it could ask the administration to come back in the, I don't know, first quarter or sometime early next year with more information on the police officers, and that would probably go in the transmittal letter.
That's correct. It would be transmittal letter to direct that, and then if the funding were to come later, that would be a budget amendment.
Bill?
I guess 2 comments. One, I do have a problem approving positions when we can't seem to get to full staffing. So I wonder that if we can't get to full staffing, why are we approving new positions? The other thing is you define these as 2 questions. I guess I have a problem also approving positions and not funding them. That doesn't make sense to me. If we're going to approve positions, we should fund them. If we're not going to fund them, why are we approving them? We should delay the whole thing till later, do it at one. There's no reason to approve without funding. That doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever.
Lola?
2 things. Around this subject of why we're always understaffed. If you've got a moving target, let's say it's a deer, and you're shooting at it, and you shoot it where it is, and it's running across the field, you're always going to be behind it, right? And so what the administration has shown us is that that's what we do, and we have attrition, and it can take a while to get people through the academy, and so if you actually want to hit it, you have to get ahead of it. And so that's part of this conversation about the 3 positions, and it's part of why I don't think it's fair to say the administration's always behind. We don't authorize them to get ahead of it. We authorize them just to keep even. And when we get attrition, it's one of the challenges that we have, that unlike many positions, we can't just go hire somebody because these badged officers are so critical to our community. And so I feel like I understand why we've been where we are. And then the other piece of it is I also don't understand could you explain approving the position but not approving the funding? What does that mean?
I think it takes council action for us to actually have somebody employed by the city. And one is you have to approve positions. And the other one is that you have to actually allocate money to pay for those positions. And so that's what it would be. And we do periodically have positions that are in the budget, so to speak, or approved, but we haven't actually filled those positions because we don't have any money for them. Or we've shifted them out of that position, but we still had that position. Either we still do or we had it. So the economic development director was one. I think, is that right? I'm not sure we still have that slot anymore, but there's no money for it. I can't remember how that goes.
So it's still listed as an authorized position, but there's no funds available for it. Correct.
Right.
And I think we've actually kind of maybe reduced if I remember right, we've reduced I'd have to look at the percentage. But yes, you are absolutely correct. And I think the analogy used is exactly right. I think our challenge is we know there's a certain amount of attrition that occurs every year, and these aren't people you just go and generally hire off the street. Unless you can get a lateral, then there's a quicker training time. But generally, they end up being officers that we've got to invest the time and training in. It takes about 13 to 18 months to get an officer fully fully up to snuff. So by having the higher authorization level, we can probably, what you probably want to do is a full-time staff. If your goal is 38, you probably want to have a full-time staffing of 39 because there's generally some funding for 39 because there's generally some attrition. The challenge is we won't get to 39. It's going to take at least, or 41 for that matter, it's probably going to take at least 18 months. So it's just by virtue of the fact of going through the process, we'll do a test, probably won't have 6 qualified candidates off the next civil service test, so you're probably a few months out on that, and then you can finalize the whatever the number is. So, but by getting us to that authorization level, we can probably finally start to approach 38, which is what you generally fund in terms of cash in the budget.
So a couple of things. I think there's a question about what do we actually need to do to get the service level we want. And so why I would think it would be okay to approve positions and not fund them is because I don't think I completely understand the situation yet. And if we don't approve the positions now, get a better explanation of services next year, we don't have the positions to fill. So for me, that was kind of just saying back to the administration, okay, maybe it is a staffing issue directly related to the level of service issue that we've been talking about. I don't know. I would actually be more in favor of allowing additional funding to allow them to go out and hire before they fill a position than give 3 new positions. It bothers me that for 3 to 4 years we've been understaffed because we know what that feels like. That's what we have. So I'm not sure just saying 3 positions funded or unfunded makes a difference. If you're more inclined to say we should just allow them to hire new staff in advance and give them 2 times 18 months worth of salary to get them out on the road, knowing that somebody's going to retire, go for a lateral, or be off on a sick leave, I'd be fine with that. I'm just not comfortable with 3 positions, 3 salaries in the budget this year. I don't know. Just can't close. I can't connect all the dots and say that's going to get us to where we need to be. So I would entertain another option if you had another suggestion. More money, no positions, allowing them to hire early.
I just want to make sure I understand the suggestion. It's to keep the number of targeted uniformed officers the same, but spend some money to get people in the pipeline sooner?
Yes.
Huh.
It'd be nice to see everybody out on the street before we decide the answer is 3 more added to that.
I'm not opposed to that suggestion. I just don't know what. I mean, if that's your proposal, I mean, I'd be interested to know what the chief of police thinks about it.
Sure. I know, because we haven't talked about that.
Yeah.
Or you can talk about it next year in services. Bill?
Yeah, I have, I guess, a technical question on how that works. So I understand if you have so many positions approved, you can't hire more than that many people. That makes clear sense to me. You're also asking this year for a $2 million increase in the police funding. But we don't fund, in my mind, fund positions. We get to say, here's how many positions you can have, here's how much money, and it doesn't say, it's not tied to that. So as long as you don't go over the positions, you could spend that money. I mean, if you have positions approved, and you have money in the budget, you could hire those people without us saying we've funded those positions, because it doesn't, I mean, you have the money. And I say you're looking for a $2 million increase from last year, so you can't.
We have to fund the positions. Otherwise, we would just approve millions of dollars for each department and say, go forth and work. We have a certain number of positions, and then we have funding for those positions. That's why we have items in the budget that say cost, employee costs.
Yeah, there's a cap.
Yeah.
That's. So generally what we've done is we've authorized a number of positions and we authorize the amount of funding related to each. I think what we're telling you is we've been having a problem on the police side just trying to get to that, just to spend the money every year in terms of the authorized positions. One of the solutions, I think, is you increase the authorization level. We probably would get closer to spending the money you appropriate on an annual basis, because there's going to be periods of time where you're going to have that transition.
So by what you just said, though, that wouldn't work, because if you don't have, if we funded 3 more positions, but we don't give you any money for it, you can't do anything with it. What you just said. And then you said, well, you could go and do that because you have the authorization, but you don't have the funding. So
if you give me the authorization and I have funding for 38 and you gave me authorization for 40, so come September and October or November of 2018, and I'm telling you I've got a budget deficit of $350,000, I'm going to have some explaining to do, right? I mean, so I have to live within the amount of money that you allocate for those positions. But there could be time, like, for example, if we're at 38, we know someone's going to retire, and we may be able to make an offer to somebody because we can't enroll them into the academy until they're actually on staff and they have an offer letter or hire letter. So there may be times just on the timing perspective where we're not spending any money, but they would be they would be filling an authorized position.
I hear what you're saying. I guess these little things that it seems to me that you could work around that and haven't been able to for a number of years. I mean, when I used to hire people, we always did that. You planned on those things and you worked around them. So I can't follow that. Sorry, I don't understand it.
Mariah?
So, you're saying that if the positions were authorized but not funded, that it would not stop the recruiting effort, that you could still go forward, you could still make an offer, and could you make an offer, or you could have that person go forward into the academy? I'm trying to understand the nuance of not having positions funded and how that impedes the progress just to follow along with the moving deer, because I very much agree with what Tola talked about. I just feel like this is something where we would forever get behind, and I also don't feel like the conversation that we're having right now is the solution to that issue. I think that Mary Lou is hitting on some things that might be a solution, and Bob, you're talking about some things, but I think those solutions are outside of this conversation. And I don't want to do anything where we get behind the ball. We're trying to stay at the level of service by not funding and approving and not funding these positions. We get, to me, further behind, and it's just not something that I've ever really worked with in terms of looking at staffing from that perspective. I think there's some creative solutions need to come to be looked at that are outside of this conversation. But I asked a question and then I kept talking. So
what was the question again?
So the question was just about the nuance of whether you could make an offer. What could you do if it's approved but not funded? How far could you?
So imagine that we had a civil service list that was approved and we had the full 38 staffing level, and then someone quit to take a job and they give us 2 weeks notice. So by having the assuming we had a qualified person on that list, we could make an offer to that person relatively quickly, such that we could get that person enrolled in academy if there's an opening before the person left. Where it helps us the most is if we know someone's going to retire in November, then we've got some, just planned attrition that having that slightly higher number would enable us to do some better planning. So if we knew a person was going to leave in November and we had a civil service list and we wanted to tie that person up with a job offer and say it's September when we get that firm notice, we'd be able to get that person enrolled in academy. They wouldn't officially start till that person would technically retire, but we would have someone, a job offer out at that number.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
I don't know if that was real clear or not, but
I think
I think if it does go to services next year, I think we'll be able to more clearly explain exactly how that kind of process works.
okay.
I know you want to say something. I want to follow up before I forget. One of the things that you were talking about is, attrition and retirements and people leaving or whatever that is. I remember on the Eastside Fire and Rescue Board, we get a pretty clear picture of what's been happening and what is expected to happen. Real numbers, real reasons why somebody's, they're leaving because they're retiring, they're going somewhere, whatever. And I think that's, I really still don't understand why we're having trouble filling the 3. And maybe we're having trouble filling because we're down 3 and then we lose someone and then we get 1, but we never make it. We never make any headway on the 3. I'm still not clear on that. And I'm back to what Mariah said about the, larger conversation about the problems, filling, and I do think there's a larger conversation, both about having trouble filling and what exactly those officers would do, and some sort of a first quarter larger conversation at services and at council. I don't think we lose any ground at all. I think we just get better clarity. But anyway, Paul?
Thank you, Stacy. I get the feeling, I'm listening to us trying to make a science out of something where there maybe isn't a science. The data that we do have is very clear trends since 2011, an increasing continuous growth in total calls for service. And then you normalize that per officer, even that number has grown almost 40% since 2012. We have a very strong trend of growing total calls for service. We have a strong trend of growing even calls per officer. We know that the community is growing, and we do know that there may be behaviors out there that could be property crime that are increasing. I'm not so sure about that. I don't have that data right here. But the idea that we're actually going to get any improvement or even maintain our current service level such that it is, though all calls for service are growing and calls per officer are growing, the idea that we would be better off by not trying to grow the organization baffles me. I don't know how that happens. And I think we're trying to make a science out of something that there isn't a science here. So I'm just looking straight at the information that the chief presented to us twice, and one call I had with him about one of his slides in particular. And it has been growing. We need more hours of people out on patrol. We need more hours for people out in traffic enforcement. And adding staff is how you do that. So I am in favor of actually funding these positions as proposed.
I don't disagree with anything that you said, Paul. I just want to understand exactly what the outcomes would be. So, Mariah?
So I would say I'm still struggling to understand some of this, but I'm in favor of going forward with the approval for the 3 officers. I feel like we're going to be behind the ball, but based on what we've talked about and what I've heard, I think this coming forward, if this can come forward in the first quarter and maybe early, back to services to get additional questions answered, it doesn't sound like that's going to put us behind. So based on that and based on some of the questions that I'm hearing around the table, then I would support taking that time so we could get more of those questions answered and maybe a little bit further down the road.
I think, Paul, your comments were good that it's not a science, it's a bit of an art. But I think there's also a story to be told that I didn't hear the whole story yet, so I'm still confused. I know when Eastside Fire and Rescue was looking at this, they were looking at a retirement hump where they had a lot of firefighters in a 45 to 55-year-old category, like a significant number, maybe almost 50%, and they knew over a 5-year period that they would be losing 5 to 10 a year. And so there was a real good discussion about how many people, how many vacancies you normally had due to illnesses, how many people were not coming back from injuries, and how many people were retiring. We just haven't had that. And so I think that while it's not a science, there's a story to be told about why we are where we are in 4 years of being understaffed. And I just don't think I have all the information yet as to why that is. If our police force is aging out like our fire force did, then I actually would jump to, yeah, we should go to the overhire, because you're going to bring in the new recruits as the other people are retiring. But if it's a different story, if it's injuries, if it's laterals, if it's not available out there because there's not enough kids signing up to be police officers, then I don't agree with the overhiring. So I really feel like there's more of the story that we could learn if services were to come back and look at this again, like Eastside Fire and Rescue did, see if it's a demographic thing, if it's just not enough new recruits out there, if it's laterals, if we have a lot of laterals going on, that tells a story in fire service. It probably tells a story in police services as well, if people are leaving our town to go somewhere else. So I'm in favor. I agree also with Paul that we're a growing community and we have more calls for service. I do agree to support the positions, but not the funding until the story is told as to exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it. I'm not in favor of going forward with the funding for it.
Right.
So it sounds like it would be helpful to have an overview of the succession planning that's happening and also the turnover metrics. And I'm not sure if I just can't remember off the top of my head if some of that had been supplied, but just to get to some of the questions that we're talking about.
Bill?
I guess just a quick comment. Getting back to the story being told and having full understanding, where I get to is my fiduciary responsibility is to know where tax dollars are going. If I can't explain it, I don't understand the story, then I can't vote to support it at that time. At the time when I fully understand it, know what we're paying for, then I can support that. And I think there's some general concepts such as you mentioned, Paul, that are there, but they're not specific enough for me to say let's spend money on something just because trends are some way or another. I need more specifics.
Well,
Respectfully, I think we know where our police dollars are going. I think that there are members of this council, I don't want to put words in anybody's throat, but there are folks who would like to see priorities this way or that way, or have the IPD focus in this area or that area. But I very much agree with Paul that one of the core measures is calls per officer, and I believe that the IPD is, I don't want to sound jingoistic, but I think we have one of the strongest police departments in King County, as evidenced when we've had incidents that have come up, and I trust the IPD that I think we should move forward with both approving and funding these 3 positions, and I think there's more than enough time to talk about, as we have heard amply, these 3 positions would not show up next week, and so I think we would have ample time to discuss distribution, whether the IPD is meeting the council's policy direction in how it implements itself. And so I don't know how the vote's going to go tonight, but I feel strongly that we should support both the funding and the authorization of these positions. Thank you.
I don't recall there being a claim that this was a strategy to overhire to compensate for issues within the market, and that's the linkage I'm struggling with. I never heard a claim in this ask for staffing that we need to play a different game to cover a gap that's either, that it's historical or we're forecasting because of illnesses or retirements or transfers. I never heard that. We're having a hard time understanding how you add more and you actually increase because you haven't been able to actually meet numbers in the past. We are struggling with that. I hear that. And that's the science I feel like you're trying to work through. But I never heard the chief of police say, that's what I'm doing with these positions. He never said that. He said he talked about increasing demands for service.
Are you ready for the thumbs up, thumbs down vote? Okay, so let me know if this is okay. I suggested earlier that it's two, one for the positions and then one for the funding. Are you still want to do that? Nods? Okay, so the thumbs up would be to support adding 3 positions. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, so one down, so 6-1?
6-1.
Okay, then the next vote would be thumbs up to fund the positions at this time. 1, 2, 3, go. Or read it. Read a fund for not. Is that right? Yep. Okay. And then there will be. So I think what I heard was a desire that in the transmittal letter, correct me if I'm wrong, that there was an interest in more information and for that to come back to services in the first quarter?
If the alternative is tomorrow, which is the next services meeting, the next quarter sounds like the way to go.
Okay.
And I had asked for early next quarter.
Sure. Okay.
Okay.
Next.
The next position is an additional police communications supervisor. It's 1 FTE.
Anybody have any questions about, did you want another brief explanation of it, or are you clear?
Just another quickly, this is the 911, right? Yes.
Okay, are you ready to take a up-down vote? Okay, this would be for a new position and to fund it. Since I'm not hearing a whole lot of questions or concerns, I'm going to assume that we can take one vote, and if it fails, maybe we can break it down. How's that? Thumbs up means approve the position and the funding. 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, 6-1.
Thank you. The next item is to increase the police administrative assistant FTE, so essentially increase in hours for this position.
Questions or deliberation? Okay, seeing none, then a thumbs up means that we are going to increase the position by 0.25 and also approve the funding at the same time in the same vote. Okay, 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, 6-1.
All right, thank you. The next position is the PWO Emergency Preparedness Coordinator. This again is to increase the number of hours. This would come out of the street operating fund budget.
Questions? Deliberations? All right, seeing none, this would increase the position by 0.25 and fund it by additional $20,000 to cover that additional. Ready to vote? 1, 2, 3, go. 7-0.
Thank you. The next one is a general fund position. This is for a new accountant that would start in the second quarter or delayed 6 months. This is in the general fund as well as split between funding sources, street operating, and the utility funds for this position because of the tasks that the accountant would accommodate for.
Questions? Deliberations? No? Okay, so the vote would be, a thumbs up would be to approve a new position, is that right? Is it a new position? Okay, yes. 1 FTE, and then to fund it for 6 months, last half of the year.
Yes.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, 6-1.
All right, thank you. The next position is in the new internal service fund. This is for a new position, 1 FTE, for a full year. It's called a senior ERP solutions architect.
Questions? Another, Eileen?
Can we have a slight explanation as to what the responsibilities would be for that?
Refresh our memories.
Absolutely. We'll have our IT manager come and provide that quick overview.
So this position would be the essentially Munis system analyst to own the system on a permanent basis. So right now we have limited term employees that are working on the implementation, and then their time will run out at the end of that program. But that program requires somebody to own it from a technical perspective, to maintain the system and to work with the vendor. So that's kind of the primary role, but they'll also be working on the data interfaces, so we can start merging data between all the outlying systems, because we haven't done that at all, really almost at all in the city, and so that's a gap that we have. They'll also be responsible for reporting, and this is the beginning of building a reporting paradigm, which will eventually result in dashboards and better visibility to the public. Because right now, it's not that we're hiding anything, we don't have anything to show, because we don't have anybody to do the work. So that's what this position would be for. And so the key deliverables is reporting solutions design, implementation, assist the executive and finance departments with publishing reports, data integration, and separation, better identity control of security of that particular system as well. And just managing the day-to-day tasks of new employees coming on, coming off, and just running that system. So that's kind of the overview. If you have any questions or
Questions for John? No? You ready to vote? Yeah, Tola.
I'll just point out this is just part and parcel of ERP systems, right? I mean, I'm actually amazed it only takes one ERP person for the size of this ERP implementation. It's just that's in their nature, for good or bad or otherwise. ERP tools require care and maintenance.
So we visited the city of Linwood, who has the same system. Their city's roughly our size, a little bigger. They have 6 people that are technical that run that system. So yes, you're right. One is just scraping by, but we were doing none before that, which was, well, you know, you get what you get. Nothing. So.
Bill?
And as you say, we currently have limited time folks in there now, so the job is being done. It's just not with an FTE, it's with a limited appointment.
Right, so we have a project manager who's just filling in on that,
right.
just to try to stabilize the situation, to get the program moving forward.
So we're just really formalizing that position. We've been doing it,
right.
The work and spending the money.
Yep, you ready to vote? This would approve the new position and fund it. Okay. 1, 2, 3, go. Yep, 7-0.
All right, thank you. The next one is the additional hours or shifting the neighborhood engagement coordinator from a limited term as well as a 3/4 time to a full-time regular employee.
Sorry, you just have a typo. It's 7-0, not 7-1.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's right. The invisible.
There's a ghost.
Our alternate.
That's the problem with putting up 2 thumbs.
We used that on the first one. Okay, the neighborhood engagement coordinator, questions? So moves it to permanent and full-time and funds it at that level, right? Ready? 1, 2, 3, go. 7-0.
And the last position currently on the list is the PWO stormwater maintenance. This is a new FTE, so this is authorizing the FTE. However, the Public Works Operations Director will be utilizing overtime, and the overtime dollars are in the budget in order to accomplish the goals for the stormwater maintenance program.
Oh.
Yeah, there was a science to come up with 0.61. I just have to laugh at that. But that is, you just answered, that's exactly what Brett said when we questioned that. This was actually getting approval for overtime.
Correct.
In the form of an FTE 0.61.
That's the equivalent.
So I guess I have a concern with this thing. Now, when you basically plan that much overtime in long-term, I mean, as an FTE, so you're looking at long-term overtime requirements for employees, and I'm not sure that's where I want to be heading as a way to solve our problems. You think if it's really necessary, we would hire the person versus an FTE. So this is where I get a question a little bit on positions. So our Parks Department hires all sorts of temporary and seasonal, and there's no positions on that. They just have money that they do that with. Okay? So overtime, I don't think we often authorize overtime. I mean, that's not what this council is getting the nitty-gritty of authorizing overtime, correct? So if they're going to do stuff with overtime, why are we making it an FTE? And so I'm just getting a little confused in that.
So it's really just the appropriation of the funds, right? Because it's the equivalent of the staffing equivalency as 0.61, because you may recall we budget per full-time equivalency, right. But it's really just an appropriation of the overall dollars. So it's maybe a little awkward in terms of the presentation being translated in FTE, but we're really talking about adding to the stormwater fund $68,000, which would be used for overtime.
And so actual overtime hours would probably be more like 35-40% because you're going to pay it time and a half, right? Yeah. So
yeah, I mean, it doesn't affect the benefit ratio as much because your health insurance is what it is. But certainly some of those items like Social Security and PERS are affected by overtime.
Okay. I have a concern with long-term planning of overtime. It's almost forced overtime to me, which is not something that I like to approve as a way to manage a place. And I heard, obviously Brett has a plan, but it feels a little awkward to me.
Mariah?
So I have questions along that same line. I just, for overtime budgeting, we would see that amount in a different line item, right? Not here for other departments, because we're only pulling out this stormwater maintenance in regard to overtime. But other departments' overtime is where? That's my question.
They're all captured in that roll-up category of salary and benefits. So for all departments, it's showing in the same roll-up category in the budget.
Is there something behind what's going on in that department to have the 0.61 FTE for overtime, and is it just this year, or a reason that they wouldn't just hire a part-time employee?
Sure. Maybe we can also try to pull up Brett's presentation. I think he had some background on that.
Okay.
It's the nature of the work is how I would answer that. They have call-outs. They have on-call staff to respond to emergencies. They have increasing service demands, particularly in stormwater management. So I think part of it was Brett wanting to try to understanding that we have an increment of increased work or hours that need to be filled, but not necessarily a full body, so you can't necessarily hire a new person to do a 0.61 job, or it's more difficult to find someone to be able to do that. Also, just it's an opportunity for us to cross-train across our staff to make sure that they're ready to perform all of those on-call functions. It's spread out throughout the year. It fluctuates. So the nature of the job, it's just easier to perform it via OT. Does that help?
It does a little bit. I guess if we go forward with this, what I would be looking at, especially if we do approve this, and looking at next year, like how does that impact the whole group? Like when I look at things like that, I start to think about work-life balance and how much overtime everybody's getting on their plate and that kind of thing. So I would. It would be good to have some of that information going forward if this if this would come forward again. I can understand if they needed to, take a year and get through some things, but ongoing, it's concerning.
So there's several things. He's got a few of them listed there. Some of it, too, was like, as I recall, the presentation was the new LID requirement. So, for example, they've got that asphalt that percolates. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Impervious surface. That's right. Impervious pavement. So one of the things that we've discovered is that doesn't percolate as well as we would like. Like, for example, on Rainier. So we've actually had to send crews over there and power wash the street to make sure that works. That gets done over a certain period of time, but it's not something that gets done on a regular 20-hour per week basis.
Okay.
So I think what he's saying is, so you got the LID requirements that require some intensity over a period of time, but it's generally short in duration. And then just the amount of work involved with managing the stormwater system is increased. So yeah, we got some, not just the impervious, but we've also got some of those, my brain is not functioning as well. The planters like in the street. Rain gardens, thank you. Of another example that needs some maintenance. Wild swales, exactly. So the thought was it wouldn't be necessarily a full-time or regular basis, but as needed, he could schedule that time. It gives the employees plenty of time to, work that planned overtime into their personal schedules, and then we be able to fill that.
Bob, just a question on that. Wouldn't it be cleaner then just on the whatever line item it is for salaries and benefits, just to plus that amount of money? And then next year you come back and ask for a position or that amount of money again instead of upping the FTE count?
Yes.
Okay, so that's an option.
Yeah, I think, can you help explain why it got translated into 0.61? I think it's just the hours, but really we're just increasing the overtime allocation in the budget.
It was a combination of the number of hours, and so we put in the equivalent so that there would be an FTE, and I believe that after time, as he started to manage the new requirements through the use of overtime now, then perhaps in a future year he would have that ability to fill that position with an actual new person. So this is going to be tackled by existing And so we want to have the equivalent in here as well.
As a management perspective, I respect him for thinking that way. But from a council perspective and transparency, I think it would be cleaner to show it more in overtime and then come back next year and say, by the way, we used $80,000 in overtime, or maybe it's more because it's time and a half, to complete this, and what we really need is a 0.5 FTE this year. And so it's not going to cost you any more money. You're just going to add the 0.5 FTE. So, but I understand why he would ask for it that way. I just like the other way. It's cleaner.
So I would agree with what Mary Lou just talked about. I think that having it show as an amount of money and not putting as a holder in there for a future FTE would be more transparent. And I'm just, when I see FTE, I'm used to looking at that in terms of head count, and that's how many people are there. And this is something that's a little not as clear.
So based on the comments, correct me if I'm wrong, but based on the comments, it seems to me, so this would be approval of a new position and funding it at 0.61, is that right? Staffing level? And so do we want to do, again, start with the position, and then if that fails, then it seems to me the next question to the council would be, would you want to add a deliberation item directly in the next line or somewhere and just take an immediate vote about whether we take that same money and vote to add it to the budget that the comments suggested it might be better in?
That's correct. It would actually be similar to this one, where the vote would be on adding an FTE separate from the funding.
Bill?
I hear what you're saying, and it's okay, but I think I still have problems with us at this level getting down to overtime approval. I'm sure other departments have overtime. I'm sure police have overtime, parks have overtime, and we're basically approving overtime. And this is where I talked about budget of what's in there. You have money in there. You use it as needed to get the job done. That's the amount you have to work with, and you work in overtime as needed. That you know how that works. So we're really getting into the weeds here, I think, below policy when we're getting into approving overtime schedules for a department. So that's.
I think the second question would be whether we want to increase the budget, and I'll let you tell me which line that would be, because we would have to, if we want to be able to provide enough money for that overtime, then we would have to increase a budget to provide that amount of money. Well, I don't think that that's more in the weeds than we usually do. Is that right? Yeah, it
just rolls into the various accounts. So if we know there's a planned amount of $68,000 in overtime, we put an allocation in the amount of estimated hours worked, and it rolls into the various categories affiliated with that. So you're not really,
so let's start with the first question.
Yeah, it's already in there. I guess it's removing it.
Yeah, we're moving. So let's start with the first question, and then Jen and Emily and Bob, whoever wants to address it, then you can tell us exactly what we would be doing for the second vote if the first one fails.
Okay.
Okay? So the first question is whether we're going to approve this 0.61 FTE. That's you. Okay, this thumbs up means we'll approve it. Okay, 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, 1-6.
So the money's already in the budget, so unless you want to make a vote to remove it, that would be the motion. If you want to just leave it in there, then there would be no action necessary.
Okay, but there would be $68,000 for PWO to use for that, for someone to...
For that anticipated purpose.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Just a quick comment. In listening to Brett when he justified this, I felt I was listening to somebody who had a fairly good grasp of the demand on his staff next year. And he had a good idea of the capabilities that they had, and he realized that I don't have enough really in the budget to get all the work done. And I don't feel, so I felt like a manager came forward with his justification on why he needs more in the salary and benefits line just to complete their work plan. And he also told us he's not hiring anybody else to do it. And he kind of laughed when he said the .61. So I think he knew that, yeah, that's kind of a funny little trick. But Mary Lou, I liked your comment earlier. It kind of hides the visibility. It's not as transparent. It's saying it looks like from an accounting perspective we're doing something that we're really not. So let's just not do that, but still honor what his assessment, what the need was to provide the services. And I feel like that's what we're trying to do here.
Okay.
Next.
So that concludes the list of staffing that was proposed. I'm going to jump back to the questions, and I hope I didn't lose them. Okay, so the actual question number 5, then the new positions, those were just addressed. The next question, which would be the new number 6, is shall the city authorize the proposed reorganizations of the finance and parks and recreation departments? And these, the costs associated with both of the reorganizations of the department structures are included in the proposed budget. There isn't, the positions that were, new positions were included, certainly from the accountant were part of that restructure, but the overall cost of restructuring is in the salary and benefits line items in those particular departments in the general fund.
Go ahead.
This question, you talk about getting, this feels like an administrative task completely. And yes, we know that there was the additional position that would be part of that. This also sounds like a way of asking the question, we're doing, what do you call it when it's not a new position, but you're kind of a reclassification. So this really feels to me like, rather than the org structure thing, it's like, do we do these reclassifications? So first of all, first point, thank you for asking us about reclassifications. I think the organization structure is an administrative thing. I leave that to you. I'm glad we have this within the context. What is the dollar? What is the total dollar amount for the reclassifications?
We don't, it's built into the proposed budgets in the departments. And so it is in large part the dollars that were in 2017 and the change to 2018, that overall impact. And so
reclassifications, there's increase in salary and benefits, I assume. So
is it possible to do this one on Wednesday? And get the answer?
Sure, I could speak to Parks right now, if you'd like.
Okay.
Parks and Rec at this point, it's $0 increase. However, we are in the midst of class comp, and there's some work right now to determine on the parks planner side what those salaries need to be and whether we need to differentiate between two positions based on a bunch of variables. And so there may be an adjustment to the salary range that comes forward later. But at this point in time, there has not been any additional funds built into Parks and Recreation for this reorganization.
If you wish, for Wednesday, we could give you more detail, but finance is approximately a push because you've got the deputy who is changing to a new position, which would adjust that salary, a lower position, and then you've got a couple other positions that would have an increase in the salary as a result of the reclass, and then you got the new positions, which you've already authorized. But we can give you the full details.
I can give the total now.
Oh, good.
The total is $75,000. The portion of that, because we have some salaries changing to be going down, and the overall impact to the finance department does not reflect the new position for the accountant, which is $68,000. It is not all of just that new position because we're shifting around and reclassifying.
So The city authorizing the proposed reorganization, what I can't remember without looking at org charts, which might be helpful for Wednesday's meeting, is there a commitment then on this council's, is this council then saying we agree with the new positions that could be in the future? Is that what this ask is? Because on some of them, they're unfunded, or they're not even proposed to be added, and they're unfunded. And so are you getting head nods from this council on, yes, you can come back next year and ask for 2 over here or 3 over there? Is that what we're doing?
So, well, the way the question is framed up, yes. There was, and actually with Jen here, why don't you speak to what's not included in the 2018 budget?
Let me pull up that.
I'm just wondering if we can get more.
Sure, we can revisit that.
I think it'd be more efficient if, so I suppose if this was the last item, maybe we would push through it, but I'm not. I see we have enough that we probably will have to come back Wednesday.
Okay.
So I think there's enough questions on this one that if we want to get our questions out and then come back on Wednesday and talk about that.
That's fine.
Who has questions about the Parks and Finance reorg beyond what was already asked? You want to see the reorg chart again? Talk about more details about what specifically this is asking us to commit to. Maybe the dollar amounts again. What else? Well, anything else? Bill?
I think the long term, if they're shifting positions and leaving some unfunded that are going to be asked to be funded later, kind of thing, is the long term as well.
Okay, thanks. All right. Then if we move to question number 6, this is in regards to the increase in the Arch voluntary parity contribution. Currently in 2017, there is a $50,000 contribution. The proposal in the budget, I'll bring up the highlights, is for $100,000 in 2018.
Questions?
Is that I'm sorry.
Yeah, just explain that again. It's voluntary, going from 50 to 100 that's required in 19, but we're jumping it up in 18. I forget the details on this one.
Sure. Council has not had a full presentation on this. This is an attempt to look forward and anticipate what is coming. The executive board has had a joint meeting with elected officials and staff from other member communities, and the executive board has taken action to support a proposal to make an adjustment to the parity formula. That will be going back to every member city's respective city council. As you look at what that formula prescribes as a target for the voluntary contribution from the general fund, our floor, our initial threshold goes up quite a bit. And so this was an attempt to smooth that with anticipation that council will want to build into the general fund budget the lower end of the voluntary range, as we have done as policy for I don't know how many years. That number used to be 50,000, the low end of our range. I think the new low end of the range is around 150,000, if I recall correctly. So we would anticipate that all member cities would take action on that in the first half of 2018, and then that would set the voluntary contribution range for every member city's budget in 2019. But because we have a jump, we thought we could begin to smooth the curve. It's voluntary because Arch can't dictate, doesn't charge us per se. There are a number of ways that we can meet that minimum voluntary contribution and exceed it, which we have done in many years. Land contribution is an example of that. So Arch kind of keeps score of how much we have contributed to affordable housing in the region through a variety of means. General fund is just one of those, but this city, by practice, by policy, has chosen to at least contribute the minimum from the general fund each year. So our minimum will be going up if you adopt it and choose to remain an Arch member city in 2019. This just helps smooth that cost curve.
So I'm trying to figure that with years. So it's going up in 19, in 18 it's not. Is that what you said?
That's correct. But our range is more than 50,000 now. That's the minimum. We have done the minimum from the general fund typically.
Historically, right. And so you're saying in 19 we'll probably need to up that to 150. So I'm not sure of smoothing a bill by increasing payment this year, smooths it for next year. That doesn't, I'm trying to get the flow there. You're paying 50,000 more this year. Next year you have to pay 100,000 more anyway. So I'm supporting Arch. I'm just trying to think if there's ways that if we're working on our TOD thing and so forth there that we could, you know, we're putting hopefully going to be putting a lot that way as well.
Sure.
So I'm just trying to figure out, you know, why we jumped the gun here. I support Arch, but if we weren't doing that, I would probably be fine with it. But if we're really putting in a big project ourselves, we might be able to put it directly into there.
Sure, and Arch does a great job of showing our contributions over time and how they have averaged each year. Some years we have the minimum, the $50,000 contribution, which is again the low end of our target range. And then other years we've had spikes. Plus, I think Arthur mentioned this just the other day, I'm going to guess on the numbers again, we've gotten about $12 million worth of bang for our $10 million contribution bucks. So we're certainly reaping the benefit of that. The other thing that I would say is, in addition to smoothing the cost curve and not feeling in 2019 like we suddenly have to pull some revenue from one area of our budget and address the minimum for the new target, is that affordable housing has been a city council and community goal. And so this was partly in recognizing that and trying to put the funding level where we think it's responsive to that.
Okay, so is this 100,000 add to what's in the budget?
No, $50,000 add, so going from 50 to 100.
Okay, so so if it were any more than that, I would be concerned, and because we have a housing strategy work plan that we worked on, that we're working on, and I would like to know how all of these pieces fit together before I do a larger jump. I do think we've gotten just tremendous benefits from Arch. I also think we get a lot of support at this, helping our staff. I don't know how I feel about the smoothing out, but I'm fine. But I do want to state that the housing strategy and will undoubtedly include a conversation about where Arch fits into that. So I'm fine moving 50 to 100 right now. But I don't know that it signals how I might feel about increasing it later, I guess. And not that I don't support it, I just am unclear because we don't have our housing strategy done. Paul?
This data from Arch, by the way, this is our contribution to the Housing Trust Fund.
Yep.
And it doesn't really say that. I think that's important because there is another line item for arts just to be a member of the coalition that's elsewhere in the budget, and I don't believe that's up for deliberation because that's not changing much. The parity goals, and we're going to get a more detailed presentation sometime later this year. Currently, actually, Issaquah's low to high range, and has been since 1998, is the low 55,000, high 135,000. So we've actually been giving at below the suggested parity range when we're at 50. And I think part of that has been because that land donation was so significant 10 years or so ago for the Y, that it still averages out. We've made a very significant executive board, and we're going to hear more about it. Actually, they've gone through a formula, and the low will go to 152 with a high of 390. We're going to hear more about that and how they got to those numbers.
Other comments? No?
So with that in mind, I think, we can add this to the budget at any time. I'd like to see, as Stacey mentioned, the housing strategy and how this TOD project comes along, because we may be putting in a lot that way as well. So we can always add 50,000 at any time. And I'm as much as I support arts, I'm okay with holding off on this until we get that. And if that falls apart because of the taxing benefits that fall apart with the new tax plan, then that would be a different way to look at things than hoping that comes through as well now.
So the only thing that I would add to that is, as Paul mentioned, this supports the Housing Trust Fund. So our contribution on our project doesn't go into the trust fund per se. So this supports other projects in the region. So just wanted to make sure you understood that.
Right, but as the question goes from land and so forth, from our Y project and those things, we get credit for those various contributions along the way, do we not?
We get credit for that contribution, but it doesn't help to finance any other projects in the region.
Right.
So the contribution that we make to the TOD project, I think what you're trying to say, is completely separate, independent. That would be in addition to anything that we give to the Arts Trust Fund, just to make that clear.
That's correct.
Okay. Are we ready to take a vote? Okay, so the thumbs up would be to approve $100,000, which would be up from 50. Okay, 1, 2, 3, go. It's unanimous. So we have 5 minutes until we're scheduled to end, and so a couple thoughts. Jen, can you show us or give us a snapshot of how many more line items we need to deliberate on?
Let's see. Some items are housekeeping in nature. So you can see we've got a few of the new revenue adds that are proposed. We have essentially 4 on the revenue side. We have most of the line items in the initiative studies and preliminary design category, and that looks like it's about a dozen.
We have a fair amount to talk about.
And then we have 2 left. Actually, no, we have 3 left in the maintenance and operations for facility demo, the Eastside Fire Rescue increase in our partner share, and then the new one that was added, or the new dollar amount. This item was on there, but we added the dollar amount tonight.
Okay.
And then these are the capital projects that are included in the capital budget. So that.
We vote on each one? No.
No.
Oh, just making sure.
No.
No, we already did that.
No, these are more so for informational only, but so that the council was clear on what those 2008 portion of a multi-year project might be.
Okay.
Stacey? Would it be possible when we to bring specific items from the capital plan forward for discussion?
Would like.
Okay, thank you.
So what I had thought about is if, since we're coming back on Wednesday, to leave some time which would be now, for council members to, if they have any information they want on the remaining items. If they have any questions on the remaining items, any more information they want to come back on Wednesday, just trying to be efficient, and then if there are any additional requests for deliberations.
Yeah, I have one. Thank you. It is in the Capitol. It's titled Master Park Planning, and it's PK029 in the Capitol Plan. And I don't recall scrutinizing it when we went through the Capitol Plan, so I took a look here. And I know this actually has to do with completing the strategic plan. I know that we worked on this through 2017. In the CIP, we show another 285 for 2018, and then another 185 for 2019. All of a sudden, I guess I don't understand what we were doing. And then in the CIP, if you actually look at the project sheet there, it's kind of confusing. It says Tibbetts Park, and then twice on two separate lines, and it lists a whole bunch of parks and talks about hiring a consultant to tell us what to do with these parks. And so what I thought was going to be a one-year process now looks like it's 3. I would like to have more explanation behind that number on Wednesday.
Can we get it in the form of how you've been answering the questions so that we can read it and ask questions? Yep. Is that okay, Paul? So it's not a presentation?
Sure, whatever way, I'm totally fine with that. And thanks for asking ahead of time, because it might have been hard to answer those questions at the spur of the moment.
Yep. Okay, so I would encourage council members to look at the list and see if there's any remaining. Is there anything else that pops out that you would like more information about? Paul?
Can I mention one? So the last one on the list, water treatment plant. I don't recall seeing the water plan, or whatever we were calling it. Yeah, I don't recall seeing that. So we're talking about funding something which sounds like it's being recommended without having seen the plan yet. I think that one, I would, it really gets into planning and design for a treatment plant, and again, the CIP has some more information in that, but it's a pretty big strategic decision to do that, and there's some little bit of justification but without any details behind it. So I would feel more comfortable if I could get, at this point, if I'm going to vote to approve that line item, some more information, especially on the justification of that spend in 2018.
Okay. Others?
Comment?
Sure.
I sent you some emails about 2 weeks ago that had to do with parking enforcement, and we've never actually talked about it. So if you haven't read those emails, it'd be good to read them. So if you have additional questions, you could forward them to Bob so that answers could be prepared, because we've actually never had a presentation on it.
Any other requests for Wednesday? Right. Okay, so we have a couple of members of the public here. Does anybody have any comments for us? Just because I have so much respect that you showed up at 9:30. No? Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, just the other one I was looking at, the council retreat one is one I talked about a little bit.
We're going to talk about all of them. Is there some
Okay.
specific additional information you want for Wednesday?
Okay. All right.
Is that okay? Is that what you wanted to know? Yeah, we're going to talk about the rest of them. Okay. Paul?
PK012, Creekside and sensitive land purchases. Just thought I'd start with the CIP number. It's also on the capital list. It makes an assumption which I don't understand. I think it makes an assumption because this is not from the last bond.
Correct.
So I want to know the assumption behind this. Is this assuming that we're going to do another parks and open space bond in 2018?
18, yes, that's correct.
Other questions for Wednesday? Bill?
Just a quick one. To verify, under capital, also PC replacements of 130,000, that is what we talked about earlier. It's showing here, but it's really in the IT fund, coming out of that, right?
Yes, that's
Services
correct.
fund. Yeah, that says so right there. Great, thank you.
Yes.
You're okay on that? Do you need more information, or you just had a question? Okay. Anything else? All right, seeing none, we're adjourned, so I'll see you all on Wednesday. See you all super later, like Wednesday.